They look like ordinary forests now, quiet, almost peaceful. But if you step in far enough, the ground changes. It softens under your feet. The trees grow in strange, perfect lines. And every so often, you'll find something the earth has pushed back to the surface. A shard of bone, a rusted key, a piece of barbed wire curled like a question that no one wants to answer. These are the ghost camps of the Holocaust, places the Nazis tried to erase so completely that history itself would forget them. No memorials, no signs, no survivors left to describe what happened here. Just silence. A silence so heavy that when you stand in it, you can feel a story trying to claw its way out of the soil. And tonight, we're going into that silence, into the places where an entire world disappeared, yet never truly left. Don't look away. This is the part of the Holocaust the world was never meant to see. Chapter 1. Before the Silence. How the Nazi camp system was born. It begins in a place where no one should ever hear laughter, yet witnesses swore they did. A field in eastern Poland, quiet now, overgrown, dotted with birch trees. A place where the air feels unnaturally still, thick with the weight of things left unsaid. Decades after the war, a small excavation team uncovered fragments of concrete lined in a way that did not match the natural world. Someone swore they heard a distant, childlike giggle echo through the trees. Another researcher said that cannot be possible. But on that windless afternoon, everyone felt it, like the world itself was remembering something it tried for too long to forget. And to understand why places like this exist, why so many once deadly landscapes slipped into silence, we have to go back to the beginning. Long before the ghost camps, long before the forest reclaimed the evidence. Back to the moment the Nazi camp system was imagined before it became a machine. In the early years of the Third Reich, there were no sprawling compounds, no vast killing centers, no industrialized corridors of murder. There were instead ideas, dangerous ones, spoken in wood-paneled rooms heavy with cigarette smoke and ambition. Men in uniforms leaned over maps, their voices low, calm, almost casual, as they discussed entire populations like they were pieces on a board. These conversations took place far from the chaos they would one day produce. But every atrocity that followed began in these quiet rooms where the air smelled of ink, tobacco, and polished oak. It was here that the ideological blueprint took shape. Inside the Reich Security Main Office, the RSHA, a new type of administrative monster was forming. It merged intelligence, secret police, and ideological enforcement into one central authority, a place where brutality was not simply allowed but systematized. The men who worked here believed they were architects of a new world, one purified through surveillance, control, and fear. Their calculations were cold, their language clinical, but beneath the bureaucratic vocabulary was something far more primal, hatred sharpened into policy. This is where the camp system truly began, not with barbed wire, but with paperwork. As the regime expanded, so did its appetite for enemies. Jews, communists, Roma, political opponents, homosexuals, and anyone the Nazis labeled undesirable were swept into a widening net. The early camps that emerged in recycled factories, empty warehouses, and makeshift barracks were not yet the massive complexes we recognize today. They were chaotic, improvised, brutal, but crucially they were prototypes. Places like Dachau, one of the first, felt like experiments in subjugation. Prisoners were beaten without reason, forced to stand for hours until their legs trembled, subjected to routines designed to break the spirit long before the body. The smell of wet concrete and sweat hung in the air. Guards shouted orders that echoed against walls stained with moisture. Prisoners learned quickly not to look anyone in the eyes. Everything about these early camps felt unstable, shifting, like a living thing still figuring out its purpose. But they revealed something to the regime, the power of confinement, the simplicity of using walls and wire to control not just bodies, but entire categories of people. Over time, the improvisation faded. The chaos hardened into structure. A hierarchy of camps emerged, each serving a specific ideological and logistical function. The Nazi leadership began speaking about them as a network, interconnected, flexible, and expandable. They created categories that would define countless destinies: transit camps for temporary holding, labor camps for forced industry, concentration camps for punishment and torment, and extermination camps designed for one purpose alone. Each classification represented a step deeper into darkness. Each made the next stage feel like the natural evolution of the one before. This is where the silence of the abandoned camps begins, because many of the earliest sites were never intended to last. They were stepping stones towards something far larger. They were places where methods were tested, refined, and discarded. Some camps expanded rapidly, absorbing thousands of prisoners as the Nazi state grew more confident in its machinery. Others, poorly located or too small, were quietly abandoned once their usefulness ended. These early disappearances created the first ghost camps, places where suffering occurred, but historical records remained thin, scattered, or lost. By the late 1930s, the RSHA saw the camp system as a tool, not just for control, but for shaping society itself. They believed they could re-engineer the population by removing threats and exploiting bodies. The logic was chilling. Camps could isolate enemies. Camps could supply labor. Camps could eliminate entire communities. This cold, ideological efficiency seeped into every decision. Men in uniforms walked through construction sites with clipboards, checking measurements for barracks that would soon overflow with human beings. They examined the placement of fences, guard towers, kitchens, and latrines, as if designing a factory. And in a way, they were. The camps became a hierarchy mirroring the Nazi worldview. Rigid, merciless, obsessed with classification. The KL system, concentration slager, functioned like the spine of this network. Around it grew dozens, then hundreds, then more than 1,000 satellite camps, each connected to industries that benefited from unpaid labor. The sound of hammers striking metal, saws cutting through timber, and boots crunching over frozen dirt filled the air. Prisoners moved like ghosts, even while alive, shuffling between barracks and work details, the smell of smoke and dust clinging to their clothes. But not every camp thrived in this twisted architecture. Some were too remote, built in swamps or forests where disease ran rampant. Others lacked rail access and quickly became logistical burdens. A few were constructed to manage temporary crises, like overcrowded ghettos or sudden surges in arrests, only to be dismantled once the situation shifted. These forgotten sites rarely appear on maps today. Grass covers their footprints. Trees grow where guard towers once stood. They were never given memorials because their existence was brief, their horrors undocumented except in scattered testimonies. In the early war years, as Germany conquered territory after territory, the camp system ballooned with terrifying speed. The RSHA expanded its authority, absorbing local police forces and establishing control over vast regions of occupied Europe. The smell of smoke from burning villages drifted across new front lines. Trains rattled along newly captured railways. At night, the distant hum of engines carried the sound of entire families being transported under cover of darkness. And each new conquest brought opportunities to build new camps, some vast, others tiny, many destined for abandonment once their immediate purpose was fulfilled. Labor camps multiplied near quarries, mines, and factories. Prisoners were worked to exhaustion in places where stone dust filled their lungs and the sun beat down on their backs. They touched rough wooden tools until splinters embedded deep into their skin. They felt the sting of winter wind cutting through thin uniforms. They heard the crack of whips and the mechanical rhythm of assembly lines demanding more than any human body could endure. These camps often vanished once the surrounding industries collapsed under wartime strain. They were torn down, burned, or simply left to rot. Transit camps emerged as way stations, brief, nightmarish pauses for people about to disappear into the larger machinery of genocide. These were places of confusion, fear, and the choking smell of overcrowded rooms. Prisoners clutched small bags, unsure if they would stay a day, a week, or an hour. Few remembered them clearly. Even fewer survived long enough to testify. Many of these transit sites were abandoned within months, leaving behind almost no physical remnants. Their ghostly fate was sealed the moment the last train departed. But the darkest evolution was yet to come, and it grew directly from the ideological roots planted years earlier. As the Nazi leadership embraced the final solution, they needed a new kind of camp, one that did not require expansion, labor organization, or logistical support. They needed places built solely for destruction. These extermination camps, with their gas chambers and cremation pits, represented the final stage of the camp hierarchy. They were deliberately isolated, surrounded by forests or marshland, chosen for secrecy. And because secrecy was central to their mission, many were designed to vanish once their task was completed. This meant that the very origins of ghost camps were embedded in the system from the beginning. Some camps were created to endure. Others were created to disappear. The RSHA understood that the more horrifying the task, the more completely its evidence must be erased. They planted forests over certain camps. They dismantled buildings and scattered ashes. They murdered the forced laborers who helped with the construction or destruction. Silence was part of the architecture. What makes this story so haunting is that even in these early years, before the gas chambers, before the mass deportations, before the systematic annihilation, there were already places slipping out of memory. Places where suffering occurred without witnesses who survived. Places built by ideology, abandoned by necessity, reclaimed by nature. These early ghost camps are the shadows beneath the shadows, invisible even to many historians. As the war moved closer to its deadliest phase, the camp system was poised to change again. The categories would harden. The rail network would become its bloodstream. Millions of lives would be processed through its gates. And some of the most terrible camps would exist for barely a year before being erased. The silence in that Polish field, the one where someone swore they heard laughter, is not an empty silence. It is the echo of this origin story, a story that began with paperwork, with ideology, with men who believed they were building a new world. A story that soon would grow into something far larger, far darker. And as we move forward, deeper into the machinery they created, the question becomes unavoidable. If these were only the beginnings, what did the world find when the system reached its full, monstrous form? Chapter 2. Remote places chosen for horror. Why these locations were selected. It always starts with the landscape. A quiet patch of forest. A marshland that swallows footprints whole. A quarry where echoes disappear almost as soon as they form. If you stand in these places today, you might think they were chosen at random, selected simply because they were empty or unused. But the truth is far colder. The Nazis chose these remote spaces with purpose, precision, and a chilling awareness of what could be done when no one was watching. The land itself became a collaborator, shaped not by its natural features, but by what those features allowed human beings to hide. And in that silence, in that deliberate isolation, the ghost camps were born long before anyone called them that. Imagine a dense forest in Eastern Europe in the early 1940s. The trees rise like a solid wall, their branches knitting together so thickly that sunlight struggles to break through. The ground smells of damp soil and rotting leaves. At night, the darkness feels almost alive, swallowing the world whole. A place like this can hide anything. It can absorb the sound of engines, muffle the screams of prisoners, or disguise the smoke that rises from burning bodies. This is what the Nazi planners understood. They saw forests not as nature, but as a shield, one that helped conceal the expanding machinery of their camp system. The RSHA men pored over maps, tracing their fingers along railway lines, noting the distance between towns, counting rivers, examining elevation. In rooms lit by yellow bulbs, they whispered about logistics, how to move thousands of people without drawing attention, how to guard a site with minimal manpower, how to create a place that could disappear the moment its purpose was fulfilled. These conversations were clinical, but the violence they enabled was anything but. They chose lands the world would not think to question, spaces no one traveled, regions so forgotten that even locals rarely entered them. The sound of wind brushing through the grass, the rustle of branches, the distant croak of frogs in marsh water. These were the noises that ensured secrecy. These were the places designed to swallow evidence. Some camps were placed in abandoned industrial zones, factories left to decay, brickyards overrun with weeds, empty barracks from old wars. These spaces smelled of rust and mildew, their walls stained with age. They offered perfect camouflage. A new shipment of prisoners. Workers would assume it was simply a shift change. Smoke rising from chimneys. Factories produced smoke. A line of guards patrolling the perimeter. Anyone passing by might believe they were protecting something valuable, not murdering those forced to labor within. The ghost camps that once lived inside these industrial ruins would later fade into the land itself, their foundations crumbling until what remained could barely be distinguished from rubble. But the most haunting locations were the ones chosen for annihilation camps. Remote, quiet, isolated, nearly impossible to reach without a deliberate journey. Places like these were selected because they existed on the edge of the world, balancing between wilderness and civilization. The Nazis wanted destinations where the trains could run efficiently, but where the towns were distant enough that people would not wander near. It required a very specific geography. Too close to a city, and rumors would spread. Too far, and transporting prisoners would become impractical. So they chose rural stations where the only sound was the distant whistle of locomotives. They built camps near bogs that smelled of stagnant water. They cut trees and drained land only where absolutely necessary, ensuring nature itself would close in around the site once they abandoned it. In these places, time moved differently. A scream might drift upward, catch in the branches, and vanish. The boots of guards compressed moss that rose back into shape by morning. Bodies buried in shallow pits decomposed faster, the soil wet and hungry. These lands were more than settings. They became accomplices, and when the war ended, they reclaimed what the Nazis left behind, erasing the outlines of foundations, swallowing buried artifacts, pulling fences back into the earth. These natural processes created the ghost camps modern researchers struggle to locate. Even trained archaeologists sometimes walk across a killing field without realizing it. The Nazis also considered the temperament of local populations. In regions where anti-Semitism or political alignment was already strong, they placed camps knowing the community would remain silent. The smell of burning hair drifting on the wind might be ignored. The rhythmic clatter of trains passing through the night might go unreported. A farmer finding discarded shoes near the tree line might say nothing. Silence was not just a feature of the land. It was a social tool. And in places where the local population was less trusted, the Nazis placed camps deeper still, choosing landscapes so hostile that no one dared enter them. There were other factors, too, factors that shaped the hierarchy and fate of each camp. Rail networks dictated life and death. A site with no rail access could never grow large. These became labor camps, small and temporary, feeding nearby industries until disease or starvation wiped out the prisoners. When the workers died, the Nazis would simply abandon the camp, burning the barracks, scattering ashes, leaving little but charred beams and the faint odor of soot. These sites often vanished within months, the land healing quickly around them. Today, hikers pass through some of these forgotten places unaware that hundreds or even thousands perished beneath their feet. Topography mattered as well. Camps built on flat ground could expand quickly, transforming from small outposts to sprawling complexes in just weeks. Camps on uneven terrain remained limited, intended for short-term brutality, not long-term operation. Soil composition determined whether mass graves would flood, whether bodies could be burned efficiently, whether structures would collapse in winter. These decisions sound like engineering discussions on paper, but each choice represented thousands of lives. The Nazis selected landscapes with the same cold calculus one might use when choosing the location for a warehouse, except the product being moved was human. One of the most disturbing aspects of these choices is how carefully the Nazis planned for disappearance. Some camps were built with the explicit intention of being erased once their task was complete. Engineers installed wooden posts instead of concrete, knowing they would rot quickly. Barracks were constructed without foundations so they could be dismantled in days. In some sites, drains were designed to help wash away blood, slurry, and ash. The smell of burning flesh that once hung over these fields was meant to be temporary. The Nazis intended these places to vanish from the physical world just as completely as the people murdered within them vanished from a population. This intentional erasure is why so many of the ghost camps barely appear in historical records. What remains today are impressions, the faint outline of a trench, the discoloration of soil where fires once burned, fragments of pottery, or buttons or bone. You can stand in these places and hear nothing but the wind rustling through grass, yet feel something heavy pressing against your chest. The land remembers, even when the world does not. As the war progressed, the logic behind site selection became increasingly ruthless. Camps were placed near rail junctions to manage the flow of deportations. They appeared in valleys where smoke could cling low and linger unnoticed. They rose beside rivers where ashes could be scattered. They were placed along borders so bodies could be moved into different jurisdictions, complicating discovery. The Nazis understood the landscape like hunters. They used it to pursue, contain, and destroy. In winter, the air around these remote camps bit into the skin. Prisoners felt their fingers go numb, their breath forming small clouds before vanishing. The cold, muffled sound, creating an eerie quiet that made even gunshots seem softer. In summer, mosquitoes swarmed over stagnant water, infecting prisoners with disease. The heat made the stench of sweat, excrement, and decay unbearable. These sensory realities shaped the daily torture of life inside the remote camps, but they also shaped how the camps disappeared afterward. Winter collapsed roofs. Summer overgrowth consumed walls. Waterlogged soil shifted graves. Nature helped complete the erasure the Nazis began. Some of the most isolated camps were not large killing centers, but small satellite sites feeding the industries of war. A quarry here, a munitions factory there. Prisoners were marched into these secluded spaces before dawn, their feet scraping across dirt paths, the morning frost clinging to their uniforms. The trees pressed close on either side, their trunks cold and slick to the touch. These sites operated without fanfare. No major rail lines. No elaborate infrastructure. When the war turned against the Nazis, and they fled in haste, they left these camps behind like broken tools, discarded, forgotten, swallowed by the forest. Other sites were chosen because they sat on borders of ghettos or along deportation routes. These were the transit camps, temporary holding pens for communities being processed toward annihilation. People arrived carrying bags packed in panic. They heard guards barking orders, dogs snarling, the clatter of boots on gravel. The air was thick with fear. Because these camps served only as staging points, they were dismantled quickly once the deportations ended. A few nails left in the ground, a rusted hinge, a wooden plank half buried in mud. These were the first signs researchers found decades later that a camp had once existed. All of this explains why ghost camps are so hard to locate today. They were designed with disappearance in mind. They were placed in landscapes that aided concealment. They were built to blend into the natural world once abandoned. And they operated for such short periods, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, that few records were kept. Many survivors never even learned the names of these places. They passed through them like shadows in transit, leaving behind stories too traumatic to hold on to. And yet, despite all this, traces remain. A depression in the earth marking a pit. A stretch of unnatural leveling where barracks once stood. Charcoal embedded in the soil. Barbed wire grown into tree trunks. Archaeologists sometimes kneel in these places and touch the ground gently, feeling a chill run through their fingers as they hold objects once touched by prisoners. Buttons, spoons, fragments of footwear hardened by time. These items carry the weight of lives erased. When you understand how the Nazis chose these remote locations, you begin to see the horrifying intelligence behind their system. The camps were not merely prisons. They were instruments engineered to function efficiently and then vanish. The land was part of the design. Nature was part of the plan. And disappearance was as crucial as destruction. As the war neared its midpoint, the system would evolve again. The camps would grow, transform, multiply. The landscapes chosen would become even more strategic, even more isolated, even more suited for horror. And in the next stage, the question would no longer be where the camps were built, but how they would be used to kill on an unimaginable scale. And somewhere deep in those future forests, beneath soil that has shifted and settled 1,000 times, the ghosts of those decisions still wait to be uncovered. Chapter 3: Construction of the Forgotten Camps. The Early Years of Expansion. If you walk into some of these forests today, you might step on something that feels slightly wrong beneath your shoe. Just a little too firm, a little too flat. You look down and see nothing but moss. But beneath that moss may be the last surviving beam of a barack that once held hundreds of prisoners. A piece of wood that should have rotted away decades ago. A plank that somehow refused to disappear, as if the land itself is still wrestling with the memory of what stood here. This is where the story of construction begins, not with blueprints or official orders, but with the quiet, heavy aftermath of places built in haste and abandoned with indifference. To understand the ghost camps, we have to understand how they were built, who built them, and why so many were never meant to survive the war. When the Nazis began expanding their camp system in the late 1930s, the architecture of brutality was still primitive. In the earliest days, a camp could be little more than a fenced field with a few wooden structures. The air smelled of fresh-cut timber and wet soil. The sound of hammers echoed across empty land. There was no uniform design, no central standard. Guards improvised. Commandants improvised. Everyone involved understood the purpose was confinement, not order. The people in prison were not meant to live comfortably or long. But as the regime grew more confident and the war more demanding, improvisation hardened into a blueprint. Camps began emerging everywhere, some vast, some pitifully small, but all feeding into a system that demanded more space, more labor, more control. In these early years, the most significant construction force was not contractors or engineers. It was prisoners, men dragged from their homes, beaten in a line, and forced to build their own cages. You can imagine the sounds, the dull thud of shovels breaking frozen ground, the sharp cries of guards shouting orders, the rasp of saws cutting through brittle planks. The cold stung their fingers. Mud clung to their boots. Hunger hollowed their stomachs until it felt like an ache radiating through their bones. Every blow of the hammer became a surrender to a reality they could not escape. These men, and later thousands of women too, built every aspect of the camp infrastructure: barracks, fences, kitchens, latrines, workshops, guard towers. They slept in unfinished huts where wind slipped through cracks in the walls. They used tools so dull they blistered their palms. They were given barely enough food to stand, yet expected to lift logs, carry concrete blocks, erect fences made of steel and barbed wire. Many died before the camps were even operational. Their blood mixed with the soil that would later swallow the camps whole. But the Nazis did not build each camp with the same intention. Some were designed to expand and endure. Others were built quickly, crudely, with the expectation that they would be temporary. These temporary sites are the ones that would later become ghost camps. They existed just long enough to serve a purpose: processing prisoners, storing forced laborers, supporting nearby industries, before being abandoned. Their architecture reflected that impermanence. Thin walls, shallow foundations, makeshift roofs that sagged under snow, structures placed on uneven ground. When winter storms hit, you could hear the wood creak under the pressure, as if the buildings themselves were groaning with exhaustion. The Nazis treated these camps like disposable tools. Build, use, discard. And so the landscape is littered with ruins of places that once held unimaginable suffering. Ruins so faint today that only trained eyes can recognize them. Much of the construction process was dictated by geography and urgency. A camp near a forest relied heavily on timber. A camp near a quarry used stone. Camps near rivers often elevated their barracks because the ground was too soft, too waterlogged, too unstable. You can almost smell the dampness that rose from the soil during construction, the wet scent of earth that clung to prisoners' clothes long after the day's labor ended. As war erupted across Europe in 1939, the camp system exploded in size. The Nazis seized new territories, new land, new victims. Orders flowed from the RSHA. Build more camps. Expand the ones that exist. Create subcamps near every industrial center. No region was too rural. No forest too dense. No quarry too remote. If a space could be used to imprison or exploit, the Nazis built a camp there. And so the early construction phase turned into a frenzy. Prisoners dug foundations day and night while guards paced above them, cigarettes glowing in the dusk. The smell of sweat, burnt tobacco, and damp timber filled the air. The rhythm of forced labor beat like a grim metronome across hundreds of sites. And everywhere, the same pattern emerged. Barracks arranged in rigid rows, fences encircling the perimeter, guard towers planted like watchful eyes, kitchens and latrines built behind the sleeping quarters. Every camp followed this skeletal structure. What differed was its scale and destiny. Some camps began small, but quickly expanded into sprawling complexes. Auschwitz was one, Gross Rosen another, Mauthausen two. As prisoners poured in, these sites grew like tumors. More barracks, more factories, more punishment cells. You could hear the pounding of construction from dawn until nightfall. Dust filled the air. The smell of fresh cut would mingled with the stench of overcrowding. These camps were built to last, and their longevity came at the cost of countless lives. But many camps did not follow this path. They flickered into existence, and then vanished just as quickly. Some lasted only months. A few existed mere weeks. These forgotten sites served specific needs: to process a deportation wave, to clear a ghetto, to support a local industry, to hold prisoners temporarily before marching them elsewhere. The Nazis put little effort into solidifying these structures. The barracks were flimsy. The roofs leaked. The fences wobbled in the wind. These were the first ghost camps, and their disappearance began the moment they were constructed. To understand the physical feel of these places, picture a prisoner gripping a wooden beam with frozen fingers. He lifts it with another man, both trembling from starvation. Their breath fogs the air. Their boots crunch on frost. The wood feels rough, splintering into their palms. A guard shouts. A dog barks. Somewhere a hammer crashes against metal. These sensory details matter because they shaped how the camps were built, and later, how they fell apart. When the Nazis built subcamps near factories, the surroundings smelled of oil and machinery. The ground vibrated with the hum of industrial work. Prisoners heard the shriek of metal, the clanking of chains, the grinding of gears. They constructed workshops designed to exploit labor as soon as possible. These subcamps were often so small and crude that after the war, they simply dissolved into the land. A few concrete slabs, a rusted bolt, a doorway foundation nearly erased by time. This is why many subcamps remain ghostly mysteries. Scholars know they existed, but not where. Camps near quarries were different. Dust hung over everything like a pale fog. Prisoners wiped their eyes constantly. Their hands turned white from limestone powder. They built barracks that quickly deteriorated under harsh winds. With the ground uneven and rocky, structures never sat properly. Doors tilted, floors warped. When these camps were abandoned, storms shattered the fragile walls. Rain eroded the remains. Decades later, visitors walk across these quarries unaware that the flat stones under their feet were once aligned into pathways leading to torment. Then there were the camps built for operations like Action Reinhard, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka. Their construction was fast and brutally efficient. Wooden barracks, narrow pathways, disguised buildings, gas chambers built of cheap materials, cremation pits dug by forced laborers who knew they would be murdered once construction finished. The smell of burning brush mixed with the scent of raw timber. These camps were engineered not only to kill, but to disappear. The Nazis planned their erasure from the beginning. When the killing was done, they dismantled everything, burned it, buried it, replanted forests. What remains today are faint outlines revealed by archaeology. These are the purest form of ghost camps, places engineered to vanish completely. During early expansion, the Nazis also built what were called holding or transit camps. These were way stations along the road to death. Large open fields, a few barracks, often no permanent features. People stayed there for hours or days. The smell of sweat, fear, and overcrowding hung heavy in the air. Children cried. Guards shouted. Luggage lay scattered. When the deportations ended, these camps closed abruptly. Their barracks collapsed or were dismantled. Today, many exist only in survivor testimonies. Another key to understanding this phase is speed. The Nazis demanded rapid construction, often at impossible pace. Prisoners worked from first light until nightfall, driven by blows from rifle butts, whips, or boots. They slept in half-built structures that led in the rain. Their bodies shook from fever and exhaustion. The sound of coughing echoed through the unfinished barracks at night. The smell of damp straw clung to their uniforms. This violent rush to build contributed to why so many camps were structurally weak, and why nature reclaimed them so easily once they were abandoned. Even the materials used foretold their future disappearance. Some camps relied entirely on untreated wood. Others used tin roofs that rusted within months. Fences constructed from cheap wire snapped under winter pressure. Latrines collapsed. The Nazis chose materials not based on longevity, but on availability. They believed most prisoners would die quickly, and most camps would either expand or vanish before long. This attitude shaped the ghost camps profoundly. As the war deepened, the construction frenzy reached staggering levels. Hundreds of satellite camps emerged across Poland, Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Belarus, the Baltic states. Many were barely more than a few shacks, but each played a role in the vast machinery of forced labor and genocide. You could walk into one of these sites today and see nothing more than a clearing. But beneath that clearing lie footprints, ashes, broken glass, metal nails oxidized by decades of rain. By 1942, the camp system had matured into a monster, structured, strategic, interconnected. But its early building phase left behind a trail of small, fragile, temporary camps that disappeared by design. These are the ghost camps that haunt the forests and fields of Europe today. Places built by starving men with trembling hands. Places abandoned almost as soon as they were constructed. Places erased, but not forgotten. And as the Nazis expanded further east, their intentions grew darker. The camps they would build next were not for temporary labor or transit. They were not improvisations. They were not crude tests of control. They were engineered for mass murder, designed with chilling precision, and some of them would exist only long enough to kill everyone brought inside. The next chapter of the ghost camps takes us into the most secretive camps of all, the microsites surrounding the extermination centers, the temporary camps built for liquidation operations, and the experimental facilities that vanished instantly once their tasks were complete. As the system accelerated, the question was no longer how the camps were built, but how quickly they could kill and how thoroughly they could be erased afterward. Chapter 4. The camps that moved, liquidations, shifts, and temporary sites. The first clue that a camp once stood in a certain patch of forest often comes from something small, too small to make sense at first. A hinge half buried in mud, a square of earth that feels unnaturally level, a few bricks arranged in a line no ordinary farmer would have laid. When archaeologists find details like this, they pause, scrape the soil away gently, and suddenly, An entire forgotten world begins to surface. These are remnants of the camps that never stayed in one place long enough to leave a full footprint. Camps that shifted, moved, folded, and unfolded depending on the demands of war, deportation, or liquidation. They were never meant to survive, and the people inside them were never meant to be remembered. But the earth, despite everything, remembers pieces of them anyway. And the story of these moving camps may be the darkest chapter of all, because what vanished here was not simply buildings, but entire human worlds erased in motion. To understand why these camps were so fluid, we must return to the early 1940s, when deportations across occupied Europe intensified. Nazi planners were obsessed with speed, efficiency, and concealment. They knew the machinery of genocide could not pause. Trains had to move on schedule. Ghettos had to be emptied quickly. Forced labor sites had to adjust their workforce instantly. When things changed, a front line shifting, a railway disrupted, a sudden labor shortage, the camps changed with them. They did not operate like fixed institutions. They behaved more like shadows, expanding and contracting across landscapes, as if animated by the momentum of persecution itself. Picture a group of Jewish families in a Polish ghetto in 1942. They hear the distant rumble of trucks, dogs barking, the metallic clatter of rifles being loaded, orders shouted in German. Within minutes, they are herded into the street. The smell of sweat and dust fills the air as people are pushed forward. Children cry. Mothers clutch bags hastily packed with bread, photographs, whatever fragments of life they can carry. They believe they are being taken to a train station. Instead, the column stops at an open field on the outskirts of town, where a few wooden structures have been thrown together in the past 48 hours. This is a temporary holding camp, built quickly by forced laborers, guarded by local police auxiliaries, surrounded by flimsy fencing that might collapse in a stiff wind. It did not exist a week ago. It might not exist a week from now. The ground smells of freshly turned soil. The air feels cold and damp. Inside the barracks, straw lies in uneven piles, crawling with insects. People huddle together for warmth. They do not know they are in a camp because the Nazis have not bothered to name it. But it is a camp nonetheless, a way station on a path toward annihilation. These makeshift sites appeared everywhere, in fields, schools, barns, former stables, abandoned factories, even inside old fortresses whose stone walls echoed with the footsteps of prisoners who never truly understood where they had been taken. The Nazis called them Übergangslager, transit camps, or Durchgangslager, pass-through camps. The names changed. The purpose did not. What made these camps so ghostly was their impermanence. They were built in a hurry, used in a frenzy, and then dismantled the moment their task was complete. When the last prisoner was transported onward, guards tore down the fences. They burned the barracks. They scattered debris. Local civilians often scavenged the beams and windows. And just like that, the camp disappeared. If a passerby walked through the area the next morning, they might smell the lingering smoke, but the physical structures would already be gone. Only the soil remained disturbed, carrying the last traces of suffering. But not all moving camps were transit sites. Some physically shifted locations as operations evolved. The Nazis created mobile labor camps, small detachments of prisoners who moved with construction projects, road crews, forestry teams, or armament workshops. 1 week, these prisoners lived in a clearing beside a railway. The next week, they marched 20 kilometers deeper into a forest to build new barracks beside a quarry. The rhythm of these camps was movement, constant and merciless. Prisoners carried their own tools as they walked. They slept in damp tents or unfinished huts. They worked until exhaustion blurred their vision. You can imagine the sound of their boots dragging across gravel roads, the crack of branches snapping underfoot, the muffled groans of men collapsing from heat or cold, the smell of campfires that barely warmed them. Guards shouted to keep pace, but the woods swallowed their voices, making the shouts seem distant and hollow. These mobile camps left almost no trace because they never stayed long enough to root themselves in the land. Another kind of moving camp emerged during ghetto liquidations. When entire communities were marked for deportation, the Nazis erected temporary staging areas. Massive outdoor pens where thousands could be held for a day or two before trains arrived. These were scenes of chaos, children clutching their parents' hands, elders collapsing from exhaustion, people fainting in the heat or shivering in the cold. The air buzzed with fear. Every smell, sweat, urine, damp earth, mixed into something suffocating. Guards herded people like livestock, and once the trains departed, these sites dissolved. They existed long enough to empty a community of its Jews, then vanished as if the community had never existed at all. There were even camps that moved because their purpose changed entirely. A place that began as a labor camp might transform into a punishment camp. A holding site might become a shooting site. A deportation yard might convert into a storage depot. These shifts happened quickly, often with no advance notice. Prisoners would wake up one morning to find new fences being built, new guards arriving, new orders announced. The smell of paint or tar would drift through the camp as workers altered structures. And before anyone could understand what was happening, their fate shifted with the architecture. One of the most chilling examples of moving camps came during Operation Reinhard, when the Nazis sought to erase evidence of mass murder. At extermination sites like Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and their surrounding microcamps, the SS created movable detachments of Jewish prisoners whose sole purpose was to dig up mass graves, burn the bodies, crush the bones, scatter the ashes, dismantle buildings, and disguise the land. These prisoners were themselves killed afterward, replaced by new prisoners, who were then murdered too. The camp's labor force moved like a rotating circle of death. These operation units set up temporary living quarters beside the pits they worked in. They ate near the fire pits where corpses burned. They slept in huts built from salvaged wood. They smelled smoke constantly, smoke that carried the scent of burning flesh. Their camps shifted across the site as new pits were opened and old pits were leveled. And when their work was finished, their camp disappeared entirely. Not a barack, not a fence post. Nothing remained but disturbed soil. In the Eastern Territories, moving camps were sometimes reactions to military pressure. As the Red Army advanced, the SS abandoned camps, marching prisoners westward. But these evacuations were not simple marches. They were serialized relocations. Prisoners would walk for days, then be held in a barn for a night. The barn became a temporary camp. Guards would force them out at dawn, and by midday they might be shoved into a schoolhouse commandeered by the SS. That schoolhouse became a camp too. Some of these sites held prisoners for mere hours before the march resumed. These fleeting, brutal shelters are among the hardest to identify today because they left almost no physical footprint. When winter fell, you could feel the cold pierce through every layer of clothing. Prisoners' breath froze on their lips. Snow muffled sound, turning the world into a quiet, deadly haze. They walked until their feet bled. They felt ice forming inside their shoes. They smelled smoke from distant villages, smoke they could not reach. Guards sometimes abandoned prisoners in a field overnight. That field became a camp. The next morning, half the prisoners were dead from exposure. Their footprints disappeared under fresh snow. By spring, the land reclaimed everything. These death marchway stations are among the bleakest ghost camps of all. If you walk these paths today, you might feel an unsettling sensation beneath the tranquility, as if the land still carries the weight of those who fell there. A slight depression in the soil, a patch of earth where grass grows differently, a line of stones that once formed a boundary. These are the remains of camps that existed for a night, a day, maybe 3. Their ghostliness comes not from abandonment, but from the fact they barely existed even when they were real. Another category of moving camps emerged from ideological experiments. The Nazis tested different methods of segregation, exploitation, and extermination. They tried mobile gas vans. They tried traveling execution squads. They tried temporary segregation pens on farms, in basements, in forests. These were microcamps whose purpose shifted with each experiment. Once the method changed, the camp changed too. Sometimes the entire site, guards, equipment, prisoners, moved to a new location overnight. The smell of chlorine from cleaning chemicals sometimes lingered for days afterward. The sound of saws cutting new beams filled the air. And then suddenly, everything moved again. One of the most unsettling details about these shifting sites is how many were located near ordinary life. A barn that housed cattle one week housed prisoners the next. A schoolyard where children once played became a holding pen. A potato storage cellar became a punishment block. A farmhouse attic became an interrogation room. These places moved not because the buildings physically relocated, but because their purpose migrated through time. Their identities shifted, flickering between normalcy and horror. When the war ended, many returned to their original use. A family lived in a home that once served as a temporary camp. Children attended classes in a school where prisoners once huddled in terror. The sounds of laughter replaced the whispers of fear, but the walls held both memories. This instability is what makes the moving camps so haunting when studied today. They defy categorization. They defy mapping. They defy simple storytelling. Some lasted days. Some follow marches. Some appeared like sudden storms, violent, overwhelming, and gone before anyone outside the system knew they existed. Historians reconstruct them like detectives. They interview survivors who may remember only fragments. The smell of hay, the texture of rough stone walls, the sound of cows in nearby fields, the echo of boots on tile. They find letters describing strangers held overnight at the edge of the village. They find archival documents listing food requisitions for temporary prisoners. They compare wartime maps with modern satellite images. And even then, entire camps remain unnamed, unmarked, unverified. They live only in the memories of those who passed through them. They're the most fragile ghost camps of all, ones that survive purely in the human imagination and in the faint disruptions the earth has not yet smoothed over. As we move deeper into this documentary, the landscape will grow darker. The camps will become more systematic, their purpose clearer, their brutality more industrial. The moving camps were merely the prelude, places where violence flowed across the land like a living organism. But the next stage of the story takes us into sites where the Nazis rooted themselves, where the machinery of annihilation became fixed and monstrous. The ghost camps we explore next were not temporary because they were small. They were temporary because they were designed to vanish the moment they completed their terrible purpose. Here, the question is no longer how the camps moved, but how they became invisible even as they stood at the center of genocide itself. Chapter 5. Operation Reinhardt's Hidden Network. The camps that existed only to kill. There is a forest in eastern Poland where the ground still refuses to settle. Even now, more than 80 years later, the soil dips in strange, uneven waves, as if the earth is breathing, slowly, painfully, trying to bury something it can never fully swallow. If you stand there long enough, the silence feels unnatural, almost pressurized, like the world is holding its breath. And then, maybe because your mind starts to play tricks, or maybe because the land remembers, you hear it, a dull, echoing thump under your feet. Not a sound exactly, more a feeling, like the vibration of something that once burned too hot, too intensely, for nature to ever forget. This is Belzec, or Sobibor, or Treblinka. It doesn't really matter which one, because these places share the same architecture of absence. Nothing towers above the trees. Nothing marks the paths where hundreds of thousands walked to their deaths. No building survived. No ruins remain. These were camps erased deliberately, meticulously. Camps that existed only for murder, and once their purpose was complete, the Nazis tore them out of the world with surgical precision. This is the story of Operation Reinhardt, and the network of extermination camps so thoroughly destroyed that for decades they seemed more legend than fact. To understand why these camps vanished so completely, you must first understand the mindset of the men who designed them. In late 1941, As the final solution crystallized into policy, the Nazi leadership realized they needed sites built not for detention, not for labor, not for punishment, sites built solely for annihilation. They needed places where people could be brought in massive numbers and killed within hours, their bodies disposed of with speed, their belongings harvested like raw materials. They needed locations close to railway lines, yet isolated from witnesses. They needed landscapes that could conceal smoke, absorb blood, hide pits, and they needed camps that could be dismantled at the end of their mission, leaving almost nothing behind. Operation Reinhard was the machinery of mass murder stripped to its essence. Fast, silent, secret. The planning began in offices far from the forests where the camps would eventually stand. Men like Odilo Globoknik spread maps across tables, tracing the routes from ghettos to proposed killing centers. They examined timetables. They estimated capacity. They calculated how many trains could pass through in a day. Their fingers tapped on paper while outside winter storms howled across Poland. These planners spoke in numbers, never names. In capacities, never families. They smelled cigarette smoke and heard the scratch of fountain pens, not the terror that would one day fill the railway cars. They believed they were building something efficient, something modern, something necessary. And when they selected the sites, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, they treated the landscapes not as living places but as instruments. Forests became camouflage. Hills became windbreaks. Rivers became methods of disposal. Silence became a resource. Belzec was the first to be constructed. Prisoners from local labor camps arrived as winter gripped the land. Snow clung to their eyelashes. Their hands cracked from cold. They hauled timber through knee-deep drifts while guards shouted and struck them with rifle butts. The smell of burning brush and fresh cut would fill the air. The first gas chambers were made of planks hammered together, so quickly the walls still dripped with sap. Nothing about the construction suggested permanence. If you ran your fingers across the wood, splinters broke off. Nails stuck out odd angles. But permanence was never the goal. Functionality was. The chambers needed only to work for as long as Jews from the surrounding regions remained alive. The layout was simple and terrifying. A railway platform. A path lined with barbed wire woven with branches to hide what lay beyond. A corridor known as the tube. And at the end, the gas chambers. Prisoners heard dogs barking, guards shouting, engines rumbling. The moment people stepped off the train, the process began. Clothing removed. Hair shaved. Documents seized. Everything quick, loud, disorienting. The air smelled of fear, sweat, urine, dust shaken loose from coats hastily dropped on the ground. Then people were driven down the tube, stumbling over uneven earth, the smell of pine needles thick in the air. They entered a building that looked like a bathhouse. They were locked inside. A diesel engine roared to life. And in minutes, silence returned. At Sobibor, construction followed a similar pattern, but with adjustments learned from Belzec. The Nazis treated extermination technology like a project, refining the process through trial and error. If a chamber was too small, they expanded it. If disposal took too long, they dug deeper pits. If the soil flooded, they moved to higher ground. You could hear the constant sound of digging. Pickaxes striking earth. Shovels scraping stones. The ground smelled of damp sand and clay. Prisoners worked until their muscles trembled. When one died, another was forced forward to replace him. These construction workers were known as Sonderkommando, and they lived with the knowledge that once the camp was fully operational, they would be murdered to protect the secrecy of what they had built. Every nail they hammered was a countdown. Treblinka was the most terrifying expression of this design. Built in a clearing surrounded by thick forest, the camp seemed to materialize out of nowhere. Tall trees muffled sound. The air smelled of resin from freshly cut logs. Unlike most camps, Treblinka lacked imposing guard towers or vast fields of barracks. Instead, it had pathways that wound through the woods, carefully hidden behind brush. It operated like a machine. Trains arrived. People were unloaded. The process unfolded with ruthless efficiency. And then the train departed, carrying nothing but the echoes of what it left behind. What made Operation Reinhardt's camps especially ghostly was the speed at which they operated. Belzec operated for only about 9 months. In that time, more than 400,000 people were murdered. Sobibor ran for roughly 17 months. Treblinka lasted about 13. Their entire existence spanned less than 2 years. 2 years in which over 1.5 million Jews were annihilated. The volume of death was so immense, the killings so constant, that the landscape struggled to contain it. Mass graves filled quickly. In summer, the smell of decomposition drifted across the forest. In winter, the ground froze, slowing burial work. Guards paced nervously, muttering about disease. Flies swarmed around pits. Wolves circled the perimeter at night. It became clear the graves would not remain hidden. So the Nazis devised a new approach: cremation. Pyres were built atop rails placed across concrete blocks. Bodies were stacked like cordwood. Flames rose into the sky, painting the trees orange. The smell carried for kilometers. Villagers pretended not to notice. In these camps, every sensory detail was an assault. Prisoners heard the constant grind of engines powering the gas chambers. They smelled burning hair. They felt ash settling on their skin like warm snowflakes. They saw smoke spiraling above the treetops day after day. They knew the world outside was silent. No rescue would come. When the Nazis realized the war was turning, they initiated the most aggressive cover-up operation in the history of genocide, Sonderaction 1005. They ordered the dismantling of the extermination camps. The same laborers who had built the camps and disposed of bodies were forced to exhume graves, burn remains, crush bones with mallets, sift ashes, and scatter them in rivers or fields. The smell of burning never stopped. The sound of bones cracking echoed across the pits. The ground frothed with the fat rendered by fire. Prisoners gagged as they worked. Some fainted. None survived. At Treblinka, prisoners dug up hundreds of thousands of bodies. The soil was dense with decay. The air heavy, suffocating. Ash coated everything. Flames roared day and night. When they finished, the Nazis shot them and brought in new prisoners to burn their bodies too. This cycle repeated until the cremation pits were empty. Then the demolition began. Gas chambers torn down. Barracks dismantled. Fences rolled up. Foundations smashed. Concrete cracked and buried. Wells sealed. Paths plowed under. Fresh soil spread across the land. Trees planted in neat rows to disguise the unnatural flattening of the ground. The sound of construction, this time in reverse, filled the forest. Hammers prying nails. Saws cutting beams for removal. Engines dragging debris. When the camps were finally erased, the Nazis built farms over some of them. They brought in livestock. They planted crops. They constructed houses. They covered genocide with everyday life. Belzec was reduced to an empty hillside. Sobibor became a field. Treblinka transformed into a small farm with a hut and some chickens. If you walked through these places in 1944, you might smell manure, not death. You might hear birds, not engines. You might see grass, not ash. That was the point. The SS murdered anyone who knew too much. They killed the Sonderkommando. They killed the guards who questioned orders. They killed the laborers who dismantled the buildings. They sealed the earth with their silence. After the war, investigators struggled to find the camps. Survivors described locations, but nature had reclaimed everything. Trees towered where barracks once stood. Soil covered the pits. Rivers carried away ash. The ground seemed eerily smooth, like a wound that had scarred over too quickly. When teams finally began excavating decades later, they found heartbreaking fragments. A child's pendant, a broken comb, a dented spoon, tiles from a gas chamber floor, bone fragments scorched white by fire. These small artifacts were like whispers rising from the soil, proof that beneath the silence lay the traces of lives extinguished with chilling efficiency. Operation Reinhardt's extermination camps are the purest form of ghost camps, built swiftly, destroyed swiftly, remembered through absence. Their power lies in what is no longer visible. No ruins, no walls, no towering chimneys. just landscapes that feel wrong, as if the ground itself carries the memory of fire. As we move into the next chapter, the shadow of these camps stretches across the entire camp system. For if the Reinhard camps were engineered to disappear, the satellite camps around major complexes were designed to multiply, growing like roots extending from a poison tree. And many of those roots, too, would one day vanish into the earth, leaving only the faintest outline of their existence. Chapter 6: Subcamps that disappeared. The forgotten satellites of giant kale systems. There are places scattered across Europe where the forest floor rises just a little too evenly, where a rectangle of land sits flatter than the rest of the terrain, where rusted nails or fragments of barbed wire surface after rainstorms. People hiking through these woods today rarely notice. They might pass a cluster of birch trees growing in strangely straight lines, or step over a shallow trench that looks like an old drainage ditch. But these marks are not accidents of nature. They are the last surviving signs of subcamps, tiny satellites of enormous concentration camp systems that once pulsed with forced labor, starvation, punishment, and death. Camps that imprisoned thousands but left almost nothing behind. Camps that lived only as long as they were useful, then vanished as if swallowed by the land itself. These subcamps are the quieter ghosts of the Holocaust, overshadowed by the infamous central complexes they served. And yet their stories reveal a brutality just as profound, just as relentless, and far harder to trace because the Nazis built them to disappear. To understand how these subcamps emerged, imagine looking down from above at a camp like Auschwitz, Gross-Rosen, Mauthausen, or Stutthof. The main camp dominates the landscape: barbed wire, electrified fences, rows of barracks, watchtowers, chimneys. But radiating outward, like spokes on a wheel, are dozens and eventually hundreds of smaller camps scattered across the countryside. Some lie hidden in forests. Others cling to the edges of quarries. Some sit beside factories, farms, textile mills, armament plants. Each one is connected by railway lines or dirt roads. Prisoners flow in and out like raw material distributed to various sites of exploitation. The subcamps form a network, an organism with many limbs, each limb feeding the central system. These satellite camps rarely begin with grand plans. Most start with a request, sometimes from the SS, sometimes from a private company eager for cheap labor. A factory manager might complain he needs 200 workers to meet wartime production quotas. A quarry administrator might claim he needs 50 strong men to cut stone. A farmer might report needing slave labor to plant or harvest crops for the German army. And the SS, always eager to expand its empire of forced labor, obliges. Within days or weeks, a new camp appears. Picture a muddy clearing beside a factory chimney, the smell of burning coal thick in the air. Or a cold, windswept patch of ground on the edge of a forest. A detail of prisoners arrives, stumbling off trucks, the chains of their shackles clinking in the quiet morning. They look around and see nothing but open land. Then guards bark orders. Prisoners are handed shovels. The first task is always the same: build the camp that will imprison them. They dig trenches for fence posts. They hammer boards into barracks. They raise crude watchtowers from rough timber. The smell of sap mingles with sweat. Frost bites their fingers if it is winter. Flies swarm if it is summer. Their bodies ache from labor before the camp is even operational. These early, fragile stages shape the ghostliness of subcamps. Because the Nazis rarely invested in durable construction, the structures were flimsy from the start. Walls warped, roofs leaked, floors softened under rain. And when these subcamps were abandoned, nature reclaimed them quickly. A single harsh winter could collapse an entire barack. Within a year, the forest floor began to swallow the evidence. What defined a subcamp was not its physical appearance, but its purpose. Some were labor camps tied to specific industries. Prisoners worked in munitions factories where the air smelled of metal shavings and oil. They inhaled toxic fumes, their chests burning with every breath. Sparks from machines flew into their clothes. If they collapsed, Guards dragged them away, leaving a smear of grease and blood on the floor. Others worked in textile plants where the constant whir of machinery drowned out human voices. The smell of fabric dye clung to their skin. Their fingers cracked from handling rough cloth. These subcamps existed entirely to serve production, and when production faltered or shifted, the camps disappeared. Other subcamps were built near quarries, sites that demanded brutal physical labor. Prisoners carried stones larger than their torsos. Their hands bled from sharp edges. The sun beat down on them in summer, baking dust into their hair and mouths. In winter, ice formed on the rocks, making every step a threat. The sound of chisels striking stone echoed across the valley. Prisoners groaned under the weight of their loads. Many collapsed. The guards did not slow the work. They beat the fallen, sometimes to death. These quarry subcamps were notoriously lethal, and when the quarry's output no longer met wartime needs, the camps were abandoned. Rain filled the pits. Weeds grew over the pathways. The stones that prisoners once carried now sit silently, unmarked, unremembered. Some subcamps served agricultural needs. Prisoners grew potatoes, harvested grain, tended livestock. The smell of manure hung in the air. The feel of damp soil clung to their hands. But these tasks offered no mercy. Guards patrolled fields as though watching convicts on chain gangs. Food grown by starving prisoners was shipped to German troops. The workers watched crops they planted with trembling hands loaded into trucks they were forbidden to touch. These agricultural subcamps disappeared even faster than the industrial ones, because farm buildings were often reused after the war. A barn where prisoners once slept might become a barn again. A field where prisoners collapsed might grow wheat a few months later. The transformation erased the horror. Subcamps also differed in population size. Some held a few dozen prisoners. Others contained hundreds or even thousands. A subcamp with only 50 prisoners could vanish almost overnight. A single truck could remove everyone. A few matches could burn the barracks. The ashes would mix with the soil. Within a month, the space might look like a meadow. This impermanence made them incredibly dangerous. The smaller the camp, the more easily guards could kill every prisoner to eliminate witnesses. These murders often went undocumented. Some subcamps ended not with liberation, but with massacre. Prisoners lined up in a forest clearing. The sound of gunshots, bodies falling into hastily dug pits, leaves trembling from the vibrations, silence returning, thick and suffocating. Today, those pits remain unmarked depressions in the earth, indistinguishable from natural terrain. The administrative structure of these subcamps also contributed to their ghostliness. The SS bureaucracy treated them as temporary extensions of the main camps. KL Auschwitz had over 40. KL Grossrosen had over 100. KL Mauthausen had dozens. KL Stutthof scattered subcamps across the Baltic coastline. Each one lived in the shadow of a larger system, feeding labor upward and death downward. Prisoners were sent out each morning from the main camp to work in subcamps, returning occasionally for medical checks or transfers. Many died without ever setting foot in the central camp at all. Their fate was sealed in the subcamp without records, without a registry, without a name that historians can easily locate. Some subcamps became infamous for their brutality. One near Mauthausen forced prisoners to crawl on all fours carrying stones while guards laughed. Another near Mittelbau-Dora made prisoners sleep inside tunnels filled with dust and engine fumes. The air tasted metallic. The walls dripped with condensation. Prisoners woke coughing, choking, spitting blood. They walked through darkness lit only by flickering lanterns. The sound of machinery echoed like thunder. These places were so nightmarish that even other SS officers sometimes avoided them. Yet despite the horror, these subcamps left almost nothing behind. Their fragility ensured their disappearance. Wood rotted, metal rusted, concrete cracked, and when the war ended, locals scavenged materials. A plank from a subcamp barrack might become part of a farmer's shed. A roof tile might be reused on a house. A fence post might prop up a garden. Human suffering diffused into ordinary life. What remains today are the barely visible traces, earthworks, depressions, cornerstones, and the memories of survivors who lived long enough to testify. But even testimonies are fragmentary because prisoners often worked in so many different subcamps that they could not remember all the names. One survivor recalled, "We marched each day to a different place. One camp smelled of oil. Another smelled of manure. Another was cold and full of wind. I cannot tell you which was which." Their words help us understand the atmosphere, the emotional texture, the sensory reality of these places, but not always their exact location. Archaeologists searching for subcamps often begin with aerial images taken during the war. They compare shadows, tree patterns, strange rectangular shapes that suggest human intervention. They walk the land repeatedly, feeling for changes in soil density. Sometimes they find foundations only a few inches below the surface. Sometimes they find nothing. And sometimes, after hours of searching, they stumble upon a single artifact, a button, a spoon, a broken tile, that brings the entire history of a forgotten subcamp rushing back. The ghostly nature of these camps also stems from how they operated at the end of the war. As Allied forces advanced, the Nazis systematically liquidated subcamps. Some prisoners were marched back to the main camps. Others were marched westward on death marches. Many were executed on sight. Guards burned barracks so quickly that flames still flickered as they fled into the woods. Smoke drifted over abandoned fields. The smell of charred would mix with the smell of unburied bodies. When soldiers arrived days later, they found ruins already collapsing. They found clothing half buried in mud. They found only fragments of human presence. A few subcamps were liberated intact, empty, silent, eerie. Soldiers walked through rows of beds that still had indentations from sleeping bodies. They touched fences still warm from the sun. They found notes scribbled on scraps of paper. They smelled fear lingering in the air like something alive. But even these camps deteriorated rapidly after liberation. Without maintenance, roofs sagged, walls buckled. Within a decade, most were gone. The true tragedy of the subcamps is not only that they have disappeared physically, but that their victims disappeared historically. Prisoners assigned to these sites often died anonymously. Records were minimal or non-existent. Some subcamps did not even have names, only numbers. When prisoners were too weak to work, guards transported them back to the main camp, often to be killed, not because they were dangerous, but because they were now inefficient. Their deaths were recorded under the main camp, not the subcamp where they actually lived and suffered. This erasure is why subcamps haunt the Holocaust narrative. They reveal how genocide spreads quietly across landscapes, not only in monumental killing centers, but in small, temporary, utilitarian sites that leave almost no footprint. They show how ordinary fields, forests, and factories can become tools of annihilation. They show how horror can unfold in places too small to notice, too temporary to document, too fragile to survive long enough to become memorials. As we move forward in this story, we leave behind the satellite camps and turn toward another form of disappearance, the power of nature itself to reclaim the land. In the next chapter, the ghost camps will shift again, from man-made disappearance to landscapes that swallowed camps piece by piece, erasing everything except the memory carried in the soil. Chapter 7. Camps consumed by nature, when forests and fields reclaim the land. If you wander into certain forests in Poland, Germany, Belarus, or the Baltics at dawn, when the mist is just beginning to lift off the ground, you might feel something strange before you see anything at all. A heaviness in the air, a hush that doesn't feel natural. The forest seems watchful. Trees lean inward as though listening. Birds gather at the edges, reluctant to cross into certain clearings. And beneath your feet, the soil feels too soft in some places, too compact in others, like someone once shaped it with intention, like the ground remembers structures that no longer stand. This is where nature reclaimed the camps. This is where the forest closed in, swallowing the wooden barracks, the watchtowers, the fences, the latrines, the footprints. These ghost camps are not ruins. They are absences, places where the natural world has taken back everything humans built, leaving only a strange tension in the landscape, as if the land itself is caught between forgetting and refusing to forget. There is something profoundly unsettling about walking in a place where the earth has buried the evidence of atrocity. The silence feels different, thicker, as though layered. The air carries a faint, sweet smell of decomposing leaves, masking the lingering traces of ash that were scattered decades ago. If you kneel and pick up a handful of soil, you might feel the texture shift. Some patches crumble softly like ordinary dirt. Others feel gritty, mixed with fragments of bone ground down by time, rain, and roots. But unless you know exactly what you're looking for, you would never guess that beneath the moss and wildflowers lies the footprint of a camp where thousands once lived, suffered, and died. After the Nazis dismantled many of their lesser-known camps, transit sites, labor camps, satellite subcamps, temporary holding pens, nature took over with a speed that astonished even the first investigators who arrived after liberation. Wooden barracks collapsed in a single harsh winter. Snow weighed down roofs until beams snapped. Birds nested in the rafters, their droppings accelerating decay. Insects bored through the planks. Moss crept along the walls. Within a year, most wooden structures had either fallen or were sagging so severely that a gust of wind could bring them down. And once the roof caved in, rain and rot devoured what remained. The smell of wet would mix with the scent of pine needles. Wind moaned through broken slats. Ferns sprouted from the floors of barracks that once echoed with coughing, whispers, and quiet sobs in the night. The natural world did not hesitate. It did not mourn. It simply expanded into the void left by human brutality, as though eager to reclaim what had been stolen. Some camps were consumed by forest with eerie symmetry. Birches grew in straight rows where barracks once stood, their alignment matching the architecture of prisoner blocks. The roots followed the disturbed soil where trenches had been dug. Pine trees sprouted in the exact footprint of former roll call squares. Nature did not merely reclaim these spaces. It recreated them unknowingly, forming ghostly outlines of the structures that had vanished. On satellite imagery, researchers sometimes see these uncanny patterns. Trees growing in grids, rectangular clearings where buildings once stood, a darker strip of soil tracing the old camp fence line. It is as though the forest itself became an archivist, preserving the shape of the camp without preserving its material. In some places, the fields reclaimed the land with equal force. Camps built in open farmland, temporary transit sites, or work camps, often disappeared beneath tall grass and crops within a season. Farmers plowed through former campgrounds, smoothing the earth until the land's memory flattened. Wheat fields now sway where prisoners once stood in formation. Corn grows where barracks collapsed. The smell of warm earth and sunlit grain has replaced the stench of unwashed bodies and burning trash. The sound of rustling leaves masks what was once the rhythmic bark of dogs, the crack of whips, the sharp cries of men and women forced into labor. But despite nature's speed, the land did not forget everything. Rain sometimes exposes objects long buried. Spoons, belt buckles, fragments of pottery, bits of barbed wire twisted into unrecognizable shapes. A hiker might kick a rusty nail without realizing it once held together a Baroque wall. A mushroom picker might stumble across a concrete block that once anchored a guard tower. A child exploring the woods might find a piece of shattered porcelain that once belonged to a prisoner who carried it from home, hoping to preserve a small piece of normal life. These artifacts resurface like messages carried upward from the soil, quiet reminders that beneath the greenery lies a human story violently interrupted. One of the most haunting transformations occurs in places where mass graves sank into the earth. The soil became unnaturally rich from the decomposition of thousands of bodies. After the war, wildflowers bloomed in bright, vibrant patches over these graves, colors too vivid compared to the rest of the forest. Survivors who returned decades later recognized these places instantly. They did not need signs or markers. The land itself bore witness in ways no monument could. Nature's reclamation has surrounded many of these ghost camps with a deceptive beauty. Sunlight filtering through leaves creates a dappled pattern on the forest floor. Dew gathers on spiderwebs stretched between branches. Birds perch on young saplings growing from ground once trodden by starving prisoners. Butterflies drift lazily over fields that were once killing grounds. The wind rustles gently through tall grass. The tranquility feels so complete that it becomes unsettling. This beauty is not peaceful. It is indifferent, and it hides a history that demands to be remembered. In some ghost camps, the forest swallowed everything except the foundations. Concrete does not vanish easily. If you dig shallowly in these places, you may find slabs where barracks once stood, their corners softened by erosion. Sometimes tree roots split the concrete, forcing it apart. The crack lines look like veins. Moss grows over them in thick green layers. You can run your hand across the cold surface and feel the roughness of time. These foundations are like bones, skeletal remains of buildings that once held entire populations captive. Visitors to these places often describe feeling watched, not by people, but by the landscape itself. They hear branches snapping even when the forest is still. They sense a tension beneath the quiet, as if the air holds a memory too heavy to settle. Survivors who returned sometimes fell to their knees, not because they saw something, but because they sensed something, an emptiness, a presence, a contradiction that no forest should contain. Many camps near wetlands or marshes suffered a different fate. Water reclaimed them. Barracks collapsed into mud. Pits filled with stagnant pools. Reed beds swallowed the outlines of structures. Frogs now croak where prisoners once whispered their fears. The smell of marsh water, earthy and metallic, replaces the stench of burning waste. Dragonflies hover where smoke once billowed. These waterlogged ghost camps are among the hardest to locate because the marsh hides everything, sealing the land like a wound covered by murky skin. The erasure was not always natural. Sometimes locals removed what the Nazis left behind. Desperate for building materials in the years after the war, villagers salvaged wood, bricks, nails, roofing, anything useful. A barn built in the 1950s may contain beams that once formed a camp rock. A chicken coop may include boards that heard the cries of prisoners. The line between ordinary rural life and the remnants of genocide blurred as materials scattered into everyday use. The land provided cover, but human hands completed the disappearance. Yet even as nature consumed the camps, the emotional residue lingered. People living near these forests sometimes avoided certain areas without knowing why. Hunters reported feeling uneasy. Farmers said their crops grew strangely in some patches. Children told stories of quiet spots where no birds sang. These superstitions were not supernatural. They were instinctive responses to landscapes disrupted by trauma. When historians and archaeologists began searching for these ghost camps decades later, they encountered the full force of nature's reclamation. Researchers hacked through undergrowth, the sound of branches snapping underfoot. They brushed aside decades of leaves, inhaling the sharp scent of decaying vegetation. They dug through soil dense with roots. Their gloves grew damp from earth saturated after years of rain. Some sites resisted discovery entirely, the land refusing to give up its secrets. And yet, the more scientists looked, the more they realized nature had not erased the camps. It had transformed them. Tree rings held chemical traces from ash that once drifted across the forest. Soil chemistry revealed elevated phosphate levels where human remains decomposed. LiDAR imaging cut through dense vegetation and revealed perfect rectangles where buildings once stood. Nature had tried to hide the traces, but on a deeper level it preserved them too. The paradox of these ghost camps is that they exist in two worlds simultaneously. In the visible world, they are forests, fields, wetlands, meadows, tranquil spaces filled with natural beauty. But in the invisible world, they are archives. The soil is layered with ash and bone. The tree roots twist through former trenches. The forest canopy grows in shapes dictated by the camp's old layout. The land carries history, not as a memory, but as a physical imprint. Walking through a ghost camp can feel like walking through a dream where something is wrong, but you cannot articulate why. The silence doesn't sound right. The trees grow in unsettlingly straight lines. The ground dips too regularly. The air tastes faintly metallic. These sensory disturbances are the echoes of structures and suffering buried beneath layers of moss and time. As we move toward the next chapter, the story will shift once again, from nature's reclamation to human discovery. For in the decades after the war, liberation did not reveal everything. Many ghost camps were discovered accidentally, by Soviet soldiers, by wandering villagers, by children playing in forests. Others were found intentionally by investigators following faint trails of testimony. In the next part of this documentary, we enter the moment the world first encountered these silent landscapes and realized that beneath the quiet, something monstrous was hidden. Chapter 8: Evacuations that became death marches. The final days of the ghost camps. The last winter of the war arrived like a blade, sharp, sudden, merciless. Snow covered the fields where forgotten camps once stood, smoothing the landscape into deceptive purity. But beneath that white surface lay tracks, scars, and pits that the earth had not yet fully absorbed. And then, in January of 1945, the silence of those remote spaces shattered. Footsteps, thousands of them, crunched across the frozen ground. Prisoners who had survived years of starvation, disease, and forced labor stumbled forward in thin uniforms that barely protected against the brutal cold. Guards marched beside them, boots striking the ice with rhythmic violence. Dogs barked, whips cracked, gunshots punctured the air. These were not evacuations. They were executions stretched across miles. They were the final phase of the ghost camps, when places of suffering emptied their last living prisoners onto the roads and turned the winter landscape itself into a killing field. To understand the horror of these death marches, imagine a prisoner waking in a subcamp, a place already half erased by time, just before dawn. The air is so cold it feels solid, like something you have to push through to breathe. Frost clings to the inside of the barack walls. The smell of damp wood and unwashed bodies hangs heavy. Guards burst in shouting orders, the beams of their flashlights slicing through darkness. Prisoners are told to gather what little they have, often nothing at all. Some clutch a piece of bread traded for a day's labor. Others carry scraps of cloth wrapped around their feet. Most have nothing but the clothes on their backs. When they step outside, the cold hits like a physical blow. The sky is still dark. Snow glitters in the faint moonlight. The wind stings their cheeks. Some prisoners collapse immediately, their legs too weak to support them. Guards drag them to their feet or shoot them where they fall. The march begins. There is no clear destination. The SS officers have received orders to evacuate camps ahead of the advancing Red Army. But these orders are vague, rushed, panicked. Camps in the east are collapsing so quickly that instructions change by the hour. Some guards believe they are marching prisoners to larger camps farther west. Others believe they will turn over their prisoners to German industrial firms. Some suspect they are marching to nowhere, simply delaying the inevitable while killing as many prisoners as possible. The chaos makes every step uncertain. Prisoners trudge through snow that rises to their knees. The sound of hundreds of feet dragging across frozen ground creates a dull, rhythmic scrape. Their breath clouds the air in short, shallow bursts. The smell of sweat freezes against their skin. Their fingers go numb. Their lips crack and bleed. One man coughs violently, a rattling sound that echoes down the column. Another stumbles, falling face first into the snow. A guard shouts, fires a shot. The man's body twitches, then lies still. The column keeps moving. These marches are long, brutal, and devoid of humanity. Prisoners walk 20, 30, 40 kilometers a day. Some go even farther. Their shoes disintegrate. Their toes turn black with frostbite. They lose feeling in their legs. Hunger gnaws at their stomachs like an animal. The guards give little food, sometimes a slice of bread or a ladle of watery soup. Some prisoners are forced to drink melted snow, their throats burning from the cold. The air tastes metallic. The wind howls like something alive, tearing through clothing and skin. At night, the march halts in an open field or abandoned barn. Prisoners collapse in heaps, their bodies tangled together for warmth. The ground is hard, unyielding. Their bones ache as though filled with ice. Some fall asleep and never wake. Others lie awake, listening to the quiet sobs of men who have endured too much. The smell of death lingers, sweet, sickening, familiar. Guards walk among them, the crunch of their boots sending shivers of fear through the frozen silence. Anyone who moves too slowly in the morning is shot before the march resumes. These were not isolated events. They unfolded across an entire continent. As Soviet forces liberated Poland, the Baltics, and parts of Germany, camp after camp emptied into the snowy wilderness. Auschwitz alone sent more than 50,000 prisoners on forced marches. Stutthof marched tens of thousands through blizzards so intense prisoners could not see the person walking ahead of them. Gross-Rosen released its prisoners into chaotic, shifting columns where illness spread like wildfire. Small subcamps, forgotten in the shadows of history, also sent out their prisoners, leaving behind empty barracks that collapsed under winter storms. One haunting detail stands out. Many of these marches passed through forests and fields where earlier camps had already been reclaimed by nature. Prisoners walked over ground that had once held other prisoners, unaware that they were tracing a path of suffering layered upon suffering. The land, already heavy with memory, absorbed new footprints, new bodies, new tragedies. It is no wonder that these regions today feel weighted with an indescribable tension. The sensory world of these death marches is one of extremes. The cold is not merely cold. It is sharp, slicing into skin like glass. The wind is not merely wind. It roars with a ferocity that fills ears with a dull hum. Prisoners' hands feel like stone. Their legs burn with pain until the burning stops, replaced by a frightening numbness. Their stomachs twist with hunger, a throbbing ache that distracts from everything except the need to keep moving. Their throats feel dry even while surrounded by snow. Their eyes water from the brightness of the frozen landscape. Every breath hurts. And yet, amid this brutality, the marches also reveal moments of humanity. Small, fragile acts that glimmer briefly before freezing or being crushed. A prisoner shares a crust of bread with someone on the verge of collapse. Another wraps a scarf around the shoulders of a younger boy. Someone hums a melody from childhood, barely audible above the wind. These moments keep people alive. They contradict the darkness, if only for a heartbeat. Civilians sometimes witness the columns passing. Some stand silently, ashamed, terrified, or complicit. Others avert their eyes. A few brave souls place food along the roadside, though guards sometimes shoot them for doing so. Children peek from behind shutters, their breath fogging the glass. Dogs bark from farmyards. Crows hover above, following the march as though anticipating what will be left behind. As the days stretch on, the column shrinks. Bodies litter the roadside. Snow drifts over them, forming small mounds. The smell of decay is faint in the cold air, but it grows stronger as spring approaches. Many of these bodies remain unmarked graves. Today, hikers pass them without knowing. Wildflowers bloom above them each spring. By the third or fourth week, prisoners enter a state of delirium. Their minds drift. Their vision blurs. Everything becomes surreal. Snowflakes floating like ash, trees bending like silhouettes in a dream, guards shouting as though from a great distance. Some prisoners begin to hallucinate. They see loved ones. They hear music. They feel warmth where there is none. This disorientation makes them vulnerable. If they slow down, even for a moment, a guard's bullet ends their suffering. Eventually, some marches reach larger camps in the west. But the horror does not end there. The camps are overwhelmed. Food is scarce. Disease spreads. The smell of sickness fills the air, sour, acidic, unmistakable. Prisoners are crammed into barracks. Many die within days. Others are forced to march again as the Western Allies advance. These death marches transform the landscape into a vast, moving ghost camp. A camp without walls, without barracks, without fences. The prisoners' suffering stretches across hundreds of kilometers. The march becomes the camp. The road becomes the barack. The snow becomes the floor. Guards patrol their makeshift corridors. And the land absorbs everything. Many marches end in massacres. Columns led into forests. Prisoners told to dig pits. The sound of shovels scraping frozen earth. Bodies trembling with exhaustion. The smell of coal pine needles. Then the crack of rifles. Birds scatter. Snow sprays upward. Silence returns. These execution sites are some of the most haunting ghost camps in existence. Places with no buildings, no remains, no markers except depressions in the earth where the soil settled over mass graves. After liberation, Allied soldiers discovered bodies along roadsides, in fields, in forests. They found groups of survivors huddled together for warmth, barely conscious, whispering in languages the soldiers could not understand. The air smelled of smoke from nearby villages celebrating retreating German forces. Snow melted slowly, revealing corpses hidden beneath the drifts. The land seemed to exhale all at once, releasing the horrors that had moved across it. Some death march survivors returned to the routes decades later. They walked through forests now lush and green. They touched tree trunks that had been saplings during the war. They knelt in places where they had once collapsed from exhaustion. Many said the silence felt exactly the same. Heavy, unnatural, filled with echoes. These routes remain ghost camps. Linear camps, stretched across entire regions. Invisible but present in the soil. They are harder to memorialize because they have no boundaries. They trace the outlines of a collapsing empire in its final manic cruelty. They reveal the last stage of Nazi violence, the desperate attempt to conceal genocide by killing the witnesses during the evacuation itself. And this leads us to the next chapter. Because while the death marches were unfolding across frozen landscapes, another set of ghost camps, abandoned, emptied, burning, were being discovered by Allied soldiers. Camps where the SS fled in panic. Camps where the last prisoners had died of starvation or disease. Camps where the silence was complete. In the next part of this documentary, we enter those first moments of discovery, when the world stumbled upon places it was never meant to see. Chapter 9, Liberation of the Unseen Camps. What Allied troops found. The first thing they noticed was the smell. Before soldiers saw a single building, before they crossed a fence line or spotted a guard tower, the air warned them. It drifted toward them on a cold wind, sour, metallic, with a sweetness that didn't belong to anything living. It clung to their clothes, lodged in the back of their throats, made every breath feel like inhaling a memory they didn't want. Many soldiers later said they knew something was dead nearby, but they didn't yet understand that an entire world had already died there. This is how the liberation of the ghost camps began, not with triumphant discovery, but with confusion, dread, and a creeping realization that they were walking into places the Nazis had tried to erase. Most Allied troops arriving in the final months of the war had never seen a concentration camp before. They'd heard whispers, rumors, fragments from escaped prisoners, or intercepted documents. But they imagined prisons or labor sites, not landscapes where the very ground seemed wounded. And many of the first camps they stumbled upon weren't the infamous ones. Auschwitz, Majdanek, Dachau. They found the forgotten ones. The tiny sub-camps abandoned in haste. The labor sites left half-standing. The temporary killing fields disguised by snow or leaves. Some of these soldiers weren't even looking for camps. They were simply advancing through forests, crossing fields, or clearing villages. And then they saw them. Imagine being a young Soviet infantryman pushing through a line of trees, rifle raised, boots crunching on frost. The sky is gray, drifting with smoke from distant artillery. You smell the rot before you see anything. Then, Through the branches, a fence appears, not a sturdy military fence, but something makeshift, sagging, patched with scraps of wire. A watchtower leans to the side like a broken tooth. The ground inside is uneven, covered in churned mud and debris. Then you see the bodies. Thin, twisted, half buried in snow. The cold has preserved them, so while their expressions remain, fear frozen onto their faces. Or imagine being an American patrol unit stepping into what looks like an abandoned factory complex. The windows are shattered. The doors hang open. Metal clangs softly in the wind. The smell is overwhelming, a mix of human waste, burned wood, and decay. You walk through a corridor and hear something faint, like the rustling of cloth. You turn a corner and see them. People so emaciated they barely look human, their eyes sunken, their ribs protruding like the slats of a broken barrel. They stare without speaking. They don't know if you are real or another hallucination from starvation. These were the first encounters with the ghost camps, places where the SS had fled, often days earlier, leaving behind a landscape of death and near death. Many camps fell into this category because the Nazis never intended them to be discovered. They hoped they would collapse into the earth, vanish beneath winter storms, or be mistaken for abandoned buildings. But war moves unpredictably, and Allied forces arrived before nature could finish its work. Sometimes whole camps appeared suddenly, like hallucinations rising out of fog. The Soviets advancing west in early 1945 were often the first to reach these sites. They marched through forests in silence, rifles lowered, scanning for enemy movement. And then they saw piles of clothing, just clothing at first, scattered in strange circles on the forest floor. Shoes, dolls, suitcases. They stepped farther in and discovered bodies underneath the snow. Some were prisoners shot during evacuation. Others had died of starvation days before. There are no fences, no signs, no barracks. Only the faint outline of a former holding camp or subcamp that had already begun blending into the forest. This was liberation in its rawest form, finding traces of life and death without context, without witnesses to explain what had happened, without the structures that once defined the camp. In other places, the camp structures still stood, but they were hollowed out, emptied, eerily silent. Wooden barracks leaned inward, their doors creaking as the wind pushed them. Paper scraps littered the ground, registration numbers, lists of work assignments, notes smuggled by prisoners hoping someone might find them. The Allied soldiers who entered these places felt the atmosphere immediately. The air was stale, heavy, thick with the odor of sickness trapped inside the walls. The floors were coated in dirt and straw. Some beds still had indentations where prisoners had slept hours or days before the evacuation. It was like walking into a nightmare paused mid-scene. One American soldier later recalled stepping into a barack where dozens of dead lay on bunks, their bodies tangled, their mouths open as though caught mid-scream. He whispered. It felt like the building itself was mourning. That was a common reaction among troops, the sense that the camp was still alive in some unnatural way, that the suffering lingered in the beams, the walls, the very soil. In several ghost camps, the Nazis had attempted to burn everything before fleeing. Soldiers found blackened ruins, still releasing wisps of smoke. The smell of charred wood mixed with something far more disturbing. Tools lay scattered in the ashes, shovels, axes, twisted metal rods. Some soldiers, not yet aware of the full scope of Nazi crimes, did not understand what these tools had been used for. Then they found the fire pits. Massive piles of ash, bone fragments, teeth. Sometimes the ash was still warm. Birds circled above these pits, screeching in agitation. They sensed what humans struggled to comprehend. Standing there, with the smoke rising around them, many soldiers felt physically ill. They described the smell as sticky, oily, clinging to the lungs. Some vomited. Others went silent. More than one soldier later wrote that this was the moment he truly understood evil. Not every ghost camp contained the dead. Some contained the dying. Soviet soldiers entering one abandoned site near the Vistula River, found hundreds of prisoners lying in rows, too weak to speak. Their eyes barely moved. Their breathing was shallow, raspy. When the soldiers offered water, some prisoners choked. They had forgotten how to swallow. Others reached for the soldiers' hands, gripping them with astonishing strength despite their skeletal bodies. Their skin felt cold, papery, fragile. The soldiers were not prepared for this. They had seen battle casualties, but nothing like this. Human beings reduced to shadows, but still alive, still fighting to exist. In one camp near Königsberg, British troops found a single survivor sitting upright, staring at the wall. He did not turn when they entered. When they touched his shoulder, he flinched. He whispered in 3 languages before switching to a 4th. His mind, weakened by starvation and trauma, searched desperately for a tongue the soldiers would understand. When they finally coaxed him outside, he shielded his eyes. The light was too bright. He had not stepped into daylight for weeks. These moments of liberation were not triumphant. They were heavy, somber, suffocating. Soldiers described feeling shame. Shame that they had not arrived sooner. Shame that they belonged to a world where such places could exist. They walked through the ghost camps with weighted steps, touching walls, bending over to examine discarded shoes, picking up a child's doll half buried in dirt. The doll's fabric was stiff with frost, its face frozen in a permanent expression of innocence. Liberation also brought confusion. Many of the abandoned camps had no documents left. The SS burned anything that might reveal the scale of their crimes. Soldiers had to piece together what happened based on what they saw and what they smelled. They found latrine pits filled with frozen waste. They found underground storage areas still stocked with stolen possessions, watches, rings, bundles of hair. They found clothing sorted by size. They found stacks of paperwork ripped into fragments. Some soldiers walked the perimeter and realized there were no names, no signs, no markers. They were standing in a place designed to disappear. In a few ghost camps, the SS had left traps, grenades rigged to doors, mines planted under snow, poisoned food left on tables. As soldiers inspected the site, they heard small clicks beneath their boots, felt the ground shift, saw wires glinting beneath straw. These camps tried to take more lives even after the war had effectively ended in those regions. Forensic teams, arriving after the initial liberation, faced an impossible task. They had to examine remains, gather evidence, identify victims, document structures that were already falling apart. They used shovels and gloves, but they also used their senses. They measured the lingering odor of decay in buildings to determine how recently prisoners lived there. They studied soil patterns to find hidden graves. They listened to survivors' voices trembling as they recounted the last days. They walked the camp slowly, feeling the weight in the air, a heaviness caused not by temperature, but by history. Villagers living nearby were often stunned. Many claimed ignorance. Others confessed they smelled burning flesh for months, but feared speaking out. Some described seeing trains arrive at night. Others heard gunshots from a forest. Their memories became part of the liberation narrative, fragmented but vital. And then, something extraordinary happened. Survivors who could still walk began leading soldiers to hidden parts of the camp. They pointed to ditches, cellars, tunnels. Their fingers shook. Their voices cracked. They dug into snow with their bare hands, uncovering scraps of photographs, letters, small metal identification tags. These items became the first pieces of truth recovered from the ghost camps. The liberation of these forgotten sites did not end when the soldiers left. Investigators returned for decades. Survivors revisited in tears. Families sought answers. Archaeologists crawled through undergrowth, brushing away soil with delicate tools. But even today, many ghost camps remain only partially understood. Too much was burned. Too many structures collapsed. Too many bodies were cremated. Too many memories died with the prisoners shot during evacuations. Still, the land holds something. The wind moving through certain forests sounds different. The silence in some clearings feels heavier. The soil in some fields carries chemical traces of ash. Liberation revealed pieces of these truths, but it also raised a haunting question. If this is what the ghost camps looked like when the Allies arrived, empty, silent, erased, then what did they look like before? What stories were lost forever when the SS tore them down? In the next chapter, we confront the deliberate destruction, the Nazi cover-up campaign that sought to obliterate every trace of these camps, leaving behind only the faintest shadows in the earth. Chapter 10: Erasing Evidence. The Nazi cover-up operations. The first hint that something enormous had once happened in these forests came not from what investigators found, but from what they didn't. In the spring of 1945, as Allied soldiers and forensic teams moved deeper into the newly liberated territories, they began to notice strange absences. Patches of ground that looked unnaturally smooth, earth that had been freshly overturned despite the depth of winter frost, tree lines that seemed too uniform for a natural forest. There were places where the land felt sterile, almost artificial, as though someone had scrubbed it clean. And that was precisely the point. The ghost camps did not vanish on their own. They were erased by design, obliterated in a systematic, frantic, and often gruesome operation orchestrated by the Nazis themselves. This chapter is the story of how they tried to destroy the evidence of genocide, and how the land itself ultimately betrayed the attempt. The idea of erasing the camps emerged long before the war began to turn against Germany. Even in 1941 and 42, as the extermination machinery reached its peak, senior SS officials understood that what they were doing would one day require concealment. Men like Heinrich Himmler and Odilo Globoknik did not speak openly about shame. There was no shame in their ideology, but they understood consequences. They understood history, and they understood that mass murder on this scale could not remain hidden unless the physical traces were destroyed. The seeds of the cover-up were planted the moment the killing began. By late 1942, the Nazis initiated Sonderaktion 1005, an operation whose name sounded clinical, but whose purpose was to make entire death sites disappear. The air in the planning rooms was thick with cigarette smoke as SS officers drew crude sketches of mass graves, calculating how long decomposition had progressed, estimating how much fuel would be needed to burn hundreds of thousands of bodies. Their pens scratched across maps. Their voices remained calm. Their eyes betrayed nothing. These were men designing oblivion. The cover-up began small, almost experimental. At first, the SS ordered small teams of Jewish prisoners to exhume bodies from mass graves around the Eastern Front, victims of Einsatzgruppen shootings. These prisoners worked with shaking hands, gagging from the smell of rot rising from the pits. The soil was thick, damp, sticky. The bodies were layered in grotesque stacks, their clothes fused to skin, their faces distorted by decay. The air pulsed with flies. The stench was overwhelming, a sickly mixture of earth, decomposition, and something metallic beneath it. The men burned the bodies on makeshift pyres. They crushed bones with heavy mallets. They ground fragments into dust. And when the work was done, the guards killed the workers and buried their remains atop the ashes. Once the Nazis perfected this method, they scaled it up and brought it to the heart of the extermination camps. Treblinka was one of the first sites targeted. By the time the cover-up teams arrived, the killing had slowed. The gas chambers were silent. The courtyard was empty. Ashes already coated the soil. Prisoners were forced to reopen the mass graves. Pits, so large the sides collapsed inward. Steam and gases escaped as the layers of bodies were exposed to air. The smell rose like a tidal wave. Men fainted. Guards screamed at them to continue. The sound of shovels scraping against bone echoed across the camp. Flames roared day and night as the pyres consumed the remains of entire communities. Fat from the bodies seeped into the earth, causing the fires to burn hotter. The smoke darkened the sky. It is impossible to stand where these pyres once burned and not feel the weight of what happened. Even today, the soil is unnaturally rich, darkened by ash that no rainstorm could wash away. After the cremations, demolition began. Buildings were torn apart with crowbars and axes. Wooden barracks were reduced to splinters. Gas chambers made of brick were dismantled brick by brick. The sound of sledgehammers cracking masonry reverberated through the woods. Prisoners dragged rubble into pits or loaded it onto carts. Metal components were salvaged. Pipes removed. Roof beams chopped. The smell of sawdust and burning tar mixed with lingering smoke. And then came the replanting. Forestry units arrived, men with shovels and saplings. They planted young pines in neat rows over the killing fields, creating an artificial forest designed to conceal the geometries of mass graves. Birds circled overhead. The ground, still warm from fires, received the trees like a fevered wound closing itself. Within months, the outline of Treblinka had faded into a strangely uniform woodland. Sobibor followed the same pattern. After a prisoner revolt in October 1943, the camp was shut down. Burning began immediately. Barracks gone. Workshops gone. Gas chambers demolished. SS engineers smoothed the land with heavy rollers, leveling the soil. They built a farmhouse over part of the site and brought in livestock. The smell of manure replaced the smell of ash, at least temporarily. But the earth held both memories. The most shocking cover-up occurred at Belzec. This camp, which murdered more than 400,000 people, was one of the shortest lived and one of the most thoroughly erased. Once the cremations were complete, prisoners were forced to remove every visible trace of the camp. Fences pulled up, posts chopped, concrete broken. The ground was plowed like farmland. Grass seed scattered, trees planted. Even the road leading to the camp was rerouted. By the time Soviet investigators arrived, they found nothing but a hillside dotted with young trees. The silence was absolute, and yet the silence was not empty. The earth beneath them was filled with ash. When investigators dug, their shovels sank into soil that was soft, powdery, and gray. It smelled faintly of burned hair and fat. They realized they were standing atop graves so massive that the land had sunk unevenly, forming subtle waves. The Nazis believed fire would solve everything. But fire creates clues. Burned bone fragments don't fully dissolve. Teeth survive. Soil chemistry changes. Even today, forensic teams can detect phosphorus spikes in areas where bodies once decomposed. The cover-up was not scientific. It was desperate, and desperation leaves gaps. As the Germans retreated west, they widened their erasures. They burned documents in furnaces that glowed white. They shredded paperwork and mixed it with manure. They dumped files into rivers. They scattered ashes from cremation pits across fields. In some camps, they used explosives to obliterate buildings. The rolling thunder of detonations vibrated through forests as structures vanished in clouds of smoke and dust. In smaller subcamps, guards went from barack to barack lighting fires, throwing fuel onto roofs already weakened by winter. Flames crackled. Sparks flew upward. Prisoners who had not been marched away lay dead in their bunks or on the floors, reduced to charred silhouettes. These subcamps burned quickly. Their wooden walls collapsed inward. The smell of smoke and burning timber drifted across nearby fields for days. In some places, the SS tried to destroy the camps too late. They fled in panic as Allied troops approached, leaving behind scorched ruins still smoking. Soldiers stepping into these sites felt the heat still radiating from ashes. They heard timbers crackling. They smelled something so horrific it stuck to their clothes long after they left. These half-erased camps became some of the most haunting discoveries of the liberation. Other camps were abandoned more quietly. The SS simply walked away, leaving nature to do the rest. Snow piled on the roofs. Rain softened the walls. Wind pulled at the last remaining structures. Within months, the buildings collapsed. Within years, the forest erased the outlines. These sites often survive only as faint depressions in the ground, spaces where soil still remembers weight. Yet the most chilling part of the cover-up was the murder of the workers forced to perform it. Sonderkommando prisoners who dug up mass graves knew the truth. When the job was done, they would die. They worked in shifts, hands blistered, eyes burning from smoke. They whispered to one another in the dark, wondering how long they had left. Many begged for a quick death rather than the slow torment of their labor. When the final pyres died out, the SS lined them up in front of newly filled pits. They were shot, their bodies thrown into graves layered atop the ashes of the victims they had unearthed. In this way, the cover-up literally buried the witnesses within the evidence. But not everything could be erased. The Nazis could burn the buildings, dismantle the gas chambers, plow the fields, plant the trees, but they could not erase geography. Riverbanks shifted, but did not disappear. Soil layers preserved chemical residues. Tree growth patterns retained the imprint of cleared spaces. And survivors, few though they were, carried memories that no fire could destroy. When post-war investigators arrived, they sensed something amiss even before they dug. The silence felt enforced. The forest seemed too orderly. The soil too recently turned. They knelt down, ran their fingers across the dirt, and felt the gritty texture of burned bone. They smelled faint traces of smoke lingering decades after the fires died. They followed depressions through the woods, footpaths worn by thousands of prisoners long gone. The Nazis' attempts at erasure had created a paradox. The more thoroughly they tried to hide the camps, the more clues they inadvertently planted for future generations to uncover. Gaps in tree growth, unnatural soil mounds, disturbed layers of sediment, scattered artifacts just beneath the surface. Nature became the archivist they never intended. And this leads to the next chapter, the moment when these silent, camouflaged, half-erased ghost camps were confronted not just by soldiers, but by survivors returning to places where nothing looked familiar anymore. Camps that were meant to disappear had done exactly that, leaving those who lived through them wondering whether the world would believe them. In the next part of this documentary, we follow the survivors who returned to these erased landscapes and found themselves standing in emptiness, searching for proof of what they knew had happened, for structures that no longer stood, for graves that the forest had swallowed whole. Chapter 11. Survivors Return to Nowhere. Post-war journeys to abandoned camps. It is one of the most haunting images of the post-war years. A lone survivor walking into a clearing where a camp once stood, pausing, looking around, and realizing, slowly, painfully, that there is nothing to recognize. No barracks, no fences, no chimneys, no guard towers. Only sky, wind, trees, and silence. A silence so complete that it feels like a betrayal. Survivors risked everything to live long enough to tell the world what was done to them. But when they returned to the sites of their suffering, the world they remembered had vanished. They stood in places where thousands had died, and found themselves surrounded by nature so serene it seemed almost mocking. This chapter is about that moment, when survivors tried to retrace their steps back into hell, only to discover that hell had erased itself. For many, the journey back began with a question that refused to leave their minds. Where exactly had the camp been? After liberation, survivors were transported to hospitals, displaced persons camps, or new countries. They rebuilt their lives with fragile hands. But memories of the camps did not fade. They lived inside them, replaying scenes at night, hearing echoes in dreams. And eventually, for some, the desire to face the place itself became overwhelming. They felt drawn back by grief, by anger, by longing for closure, or by a need to prove to themselves that the nightmare had been real. But the first shock came before they even reached the camp. Roads had changed. Train lines had shifted. Towns had rebuilt. Forests had grown denser. Survivors who had once been transported in sealed cattle cars, blind to direction, now tried to navigate peaceful rural paths they had never seen from the outside. The air smelled of fresh grass and spring blossoms, scents that belonged to a world they were not allowed to experience during their captivity. The landscape felt both familiar and foreign, like seeing a face you'd known well, but now altered beyond recognition. In Poland, survivors returning to places like Belzec or Sobibor found farmland, not fences. Grass swayed where barracks once stood. A farmhouse might sit on the exact footprint of the gas chambers. Chickens wandered through what had been a killing zone. The smell of hay drifted through the air, soft and earthy. There was no trace of the ash that once coated everything. No sign of the smoke that had darkened the sky. The only thing that remained was the shape of the land. Slopes, dips, shadows, and even those had softened with time. Survivors often described a moment of disorientation. They stood at the edge of a field and whispered to themselves, "Am I in the right place?" Some walked in circles, comparing the ground beneath their feet to the memories burned into their minds. One survivor said, "I kept expecting the camp to appear like a mirage, but it never did." Another said, "It was as though the earth had swallowed everything and refused to spit it back out." This disappearance was not accidental. The Nazis' cover-up operations had removed almost every structure, but nature's own power was equally overwhelming. Trees had sprung up where a roll call had once been held. Moss covered the outlines of former foundations. Rain had washed away footprints. Snow had flattened the last traces of pathways. Survivors walked across ground that felt alive with absence, a contradiction only they could understand. What made these returns even more devastating was the lack of acknowledgement. In the late 1940s and early 50s, many campsites were unmarked. No plaques, no fences, no memorials. Survivors found themselves explaining to locals what had once stood there. Some villagers nodded solemnly. Others claimed ignorance. A few, carrying their own guilt or fear, grew uncomfortable and changed the subject. Survivors realized that the memory they carried so vividly was not shared by those living around the site. For some survivors, returning to these places felt like reopening a wound. The air tasted of dust, not ash, and that difference alone was unbearable. They had expected the earth to scream with memory. Instead, it whispered nothing. They touched the bark of trees that had grown after the war, feeling rough surfaces where smooth soil had once been trampled by prisoners' feet. They listened to birdsong where screams had once pierced the air. They felt warmth from sunlight where smoke had once blocked the sky. Every sense contradicted their memories, yet intensified them. Some survivors brought their families, hoping to teach them, to pass down truth. But standing in front of an empty field made the task harder. How do you point to nothing and say, "This is where it happened"? How do you convince a child that the unreal quiet around them once held the chaos of death at an industrial scale? Survivors often knelt at the ground, touching the soil as though expecting it to speak. Their families watched, confused or awed, unsure what to say. In cases where some infrastructure remained, crumbling foundations, rusted fences, abandoned guard towers, survivors often approached these remnants with trembling hands. They traced the cracks in concrete, imagining where they had once stood during roll call. They touched rusted bars that had held them captive. They crouched beside holes in the earth that had been latrines or storage pits. One survivor said the remaining concrete slab felt like the last bone of a body that had otherwise turned to dust. But for those who returned to the ghost camps, sites fully reclaimed by nature, the experience was surreal. The land had become peaceful in a way that felt like a lie. Leaves rustled gently overhead. A deer might wander through the clearing. The sun warmed the air, and the survivors felt the weight of two worlds pressing against each other, the world they saw and the world they remembered. One woman described feeling dizzy, as though the present landscape were a thin shell covering the past. "I felt," she said, "that if I press hard enough, I could fall through the present and land in the past." Returning survivors often knelt and dug their fingers into the soil. Many found fragments, bits of pottery, shards of glass, pieces of metal, sometimes bone. These discoveries felt like confirmation, like the land was giving back pieces of truth. They held these fragments in their hands, their hearts pounding. These tiny relics felt like voices emerging from the earth. The emotional impact of these returns was complicated. Some survivors felt anger rising like heat under their skin, anger that the world had moved on, anger that the place where their families were murdered now looked harmless, anger that the Nazis had succeeded in erasing so much. But others felt relief, even gratitude, that nature had softened the edges of their nightmare. They saw beauty where they had once seen horror. They felt a kind of peace, not because the past was gone, but because the present had reclaimed the space. Still, almost all survivors describe a moment where they felt profoundly alone. Standing in an empty clearing, they realized that only they could see the invisible camp. Only they could hear the shouts, the gunshots, the cries. Only they could smell the burning. These memories existed entirely inside their own minds, and nowhere else. The ghost camps made the survivors into the last witnesses of landscapes designed to forget. Many survivors wrote letters or journals during these visits. Their words reveal the emotional complexity. I stood on the ground where my mother died. The grass was so green the first wanted to scream. I looked around and thought, this cannot be the place. But my hands remembered, even if my eyes did not. The silence felt wrong, like a blanket thrown over something still moving. My son asked me where the camp was. I said, under your feet. He didn't understand. These journeys also shaped Holocaust memory. Survivors' testimonies became crucial for identifying sites that had otherwise vanished. Their recollections guided archaeologists. Their descriptions of distances, tree lines, slopes, and soil textures helped historians pinpoint camp locations buried under decades of growth. But these returns came with another kind of pain, the fear that without physical evidence, the world might one day doubt them. Survivors saw the empty fields and wondered whether future generations would believe such horrors happened in places now filled with sunlight. They carried the burden of memory like a weight that grew heavier the longer they lived. In some cases, survivors returned to find that new structures had been built over the campsites. Houses, roads, factories, a schoolyard where children laughed, a farm where animals grazed peacefully. The juxtaposition was crushing. A woman who returned to the site of a former subcamp found a playground swing set standing where she had once dug mass graves. She listened to the sound of children laughing and felt something inside her unravel. She knew it was good. She knew life had returned, but she also felt the past being buried anew. Others found that locals did not want them there. Some communities resented the reopening of old wounds. Others feared accusations of collaboration. Survivors were told, "There is nothing here to see," or worse, "You must be mistaken." These encounters deepened the sense of isolation. And yet, survivors kept returning. Even as they aged, even as their bodies weakened, they walked slowly into forests where their younger selves had once suffered. They followed paths worn by animals instead of prisoners. They touched tree bark that had grown thick over the decades. They pressed their hands to the ground as though trying to absorb something. Proof, memory, identity, truth. Some brought stones to leave behind. Others brought candles. A few planted small trees or flowers. These gestures became unofficial memorials, acts of defiance against the Nazis' attempt to erase everything. Decades later, when historians and archaeologists finally began to mark and memorialize these ghost camps, survivors felt a strange mix of gratitude and sorrow. The places were now recognized, but not in the form they remembered. The memorials were clean, polished, formal. Survivors remembered mud, fear, cold, chaos. The neatness felt like a translation, a necessary one, but a translation nonetheless. Still, they believed it was better than the alternative, silence. As we move to the next chapter, the story shifts once again from emotional return to scientific rediscovery. After the survivors walked the ground and shared their memories, it fell to historians and archaeologists to uncover the physical truth buried beneath decades of soil and secrecy. The ghost camps would speak again, not through visible structures, but through fragments, soil chemistry, roots, bones, and the faint traces that time had not yet erased. Chapter 12: Rediscovery. Archaeologists, historians, and the hunt for evidence. It often begins with nothing more than a rumor. A farmer plowing a field finds a rusted spoon. A child wandering in the woods trips over a strip of twisted metal. A hiker stumbles across a depression in the soil that seems too rectangular to be natural. or someone living nearby mentions an old story handed down from a parent or a grandparent. There used to be something here, they say, something terrible. These small hints, fragile and easily dismissed, are where rediscovery begins. For decades after the war, many ghost camps remained unknown or misunderstood, buried not only by earth and forest, but by silence, trauma, and neglect. And when archaeologists and historians finally turned their attention to these sites, they realized they were dealing with landscapes that had tried to erase themselves. The hunt for evidence became a race against time, against nature, against fading memory, and against the deliberate destruction the Nazis left behind. The first investigators who arrived after the war had little to guide them. Survivors' testimonies offered emotional truth and lived experience, but descriptions were often fragmented, distorted by trauma, by starvation, by cold, by the monotony of suffering. Many survivors have been transported in sealed trains and marched in circles before arriving at a camp. They had no sense of geography. Others remembered only sounds, smells, sensations. There was a forest nearby, one might say. I remember hearing a river. The ground was sandy. These details mattered, but they were not enough to pinpoint locations. So the early investigators walked, sometimes for days, through forests that all looked the same, across fields that stretched endlessly, over hills and swamps and abandoned roads. They studied soil texture. They followed the faintest clues. And slowly, signs emerged. A rusted bolt, a piece of concrete with rebar, a cluster of stones arranged in a way that suggested deliberate placement. The smell of damp earth mixing with something faintly metallic. These discoveries, tiny but profound, alerted researchers to the possibility that hidden beneath the surface lay the remnants of camps long thought erased. Nature became both an adversary and an archivist. Tree roots had twisted through old structures, lifting beams and stones as they grew. Leaves layered over the ground year after year, compressing into a thick blanket of organic material. Rain and snow softened the earth, blurring edges and shapes. Yet, ironically, this same process sometimes preserved evidence, protecting fragile artifacts from wind, light, and human activity. Archaeologists learned to read the land like a palimpsest, a manuscript written and rewritten by both human hands and natural forces. Metal detectors swept slowly across soil, their faint beeps breaking the quiet. Researchers brushed away dirt with delicate strokes, revealing buttons, nails, belt buckles, hairpins, objects that had once belonged to prisoners. Each discovery was both revelation and heartbreak. A child's shoe, a comb with several missing teeth, a chipped enamel bowl, a fragment of barbed wire still sharp enough to draw blood. These were not just items, they were witnesses. Sometimes the land itself revealed the truth without excavation. Aerial photography from wartime reconnaissance missions showed patterns invisible from the ground. Rectangles that once formed barracks, lines marking former fences, darker patches where mass graves lay. These images, grainy and distant, allowed researchers to reconstruct sites that otherwise would have been lost forever. When paired with modern LiDAR technology, which pierced through dense vegetation to reveal the underlying terrain, entire camp layouts began to emerge like ghosts rising from the earth. Yet the rediscovery of these camps was not purely technical. It was emotional work that exhausted even the most seasoned professionals. Archaeologists often described a heaviness settling over them as they approached suspected sites, a change in the air, a silence that felt too deep, as though the forest were holding its breath. They felt watched, not by people, but by the weight of history pressing down through the trees. They found themselves speaking in whispers, unwilling to disturb the quiet. The first full excavations at Sobibor revealed something startling. Beneath layers of soil and roots, archaeologists uncovered the tile flooring of the gas chamber. The tiles bore a pattern meant to mimic a traditional bathhouse, part of the Nazis' deception. Holding those tiles in their hands, researchers felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. They were touching the literal floor where thousands had taken their last steps. At Treblinka, excavation was more challenging. The Nazis had leveled the entire camp and planted a forest over it. But forensic scientists discovered bone fragments scattered throughout the topsoil, evidence left behind by incomplete cremation. They found ashes fused with sand. They found areas where the earth was discolored by human remains. They found pieces of personal belongings, keys, earrings, bits of clothing fasteners that had resisted destruction. Even though Treblinka was now a field with young trees swaying in the wind, the ground beneath carried scream. One of the most haunting rediscoveries happened at Belzec. When investigators dug into the soil, they found layers upon layers of ash mixed with bone. The earth itself seemed to exhale history. The smell that rose from the disturbed soil made some researchers stagger backward. They realized they were standing atop graves containing hundreds of thousands of people. Belzec had no survivors to describe its geography. Everything was learned from the land itself. But rediscovery extended far beyond the extermination centers. Hundreds of small labor camps, transit camps, subcamps, and temporary sites remained unmarked and forgotten for decades. Archaeologists fanned out across rural landscapes, often relying on local folklore. A farmer might say, "My father told me Jews once worked here." A villager might mention, "There used to be a fence in that part of the woods." These crumbs of memory guided researchers to places where evidence waited just a few centimeters below the surface. In some cases, the rediscovery was accidental. A road crew digging to lay pipes struck a foundation stone. Construction workers found a mass grave when they unearthed what they thought was a small hill. A child searching for mushrooms came across a rusted key that opened a path as surely as it once opened a door. Each accidental discovery forced officials to pause construction, call in forensic teams, and confront the reality that beneath everyday life lay the remnants of extraordinary brutality. The process of excavation was methodical, reverent, and deeply human. Archaeologists knelt in dirt, their hands shaking as they brushed away soil from artifacts that had not seen light in 70 years. They used small tools, almost surgical in precision, because they were not digging through dirt, they were navigating through trauma. Some artifacts were so fragile they crumbled at the slightest touch. Others seemed impossibly intact. A metal cup with initials scratched into the handle, a toothbrush worn almost to the nub, a child's hair clip still shaped like a butterfly. Each object told a story. Each object resurrected a life. These rediscoveries also confirmed survivor testimonies. Those who had lived through the camps sometimes returned with archaeologists to walk the sites. They moved slowly, their eyes scanning the ground, searching for landmarks long gone. When they recognized the slope of a hill or the curve of a path, their voices filled with emotion. "I remember this," they whispered, or "This is where they lined us up." Their memories, once doubted by officials who believed the camps had vanished beyond proof, gained unquestionable validity. Some survivors could not bear to return, but they contributed through interviews. Their descriptions of distances, of the smell of pine, of the direction of the wind, became clues for researchers. One survivor remembered hearing a river at night. Another recalled the crack of branches underfoot when marching to forced labor. Another described the angle of the sunlight through the trees during morning roll call. These sensory memories helped pinpoint camp boundaries more accurately than maps ever could. Rediscovery also forced historians to reconsider the scale of the Nazi camp system. Previously, the focus had centered on the major camps. But as more ghost camps were uncovered, it became clear that the system was far larger. Over 1,000 subcamps, hundreds of temporary sites, dozens of vanished extermination outposts. The landscape of genocide was not confined to famous names. It stretched into forests, meadows, quarries, and riverbanks across an entire continent. Every rediscovered site expanded the map of atrocity. The emotional toll on researchers was immense. Some described waking in the night with the smell of soil still in their nostrils. Others said they felt a presence beside them as they worked, as if the land were alive with memory. They spoke of moments where they froze, sensing that the ground beneath them held more than objects. One archaeologist said, "It felt like the earth was breathing." Another said, "Every time we uncovered something, it was like disturbing a wound." The rediscovery of ghost camps also raised ethical questions. How much should be excavated? How deeply should researchers dig into mass graves? Should artifacts be removed, or left where they lay as part of the landscape? These questions complicated the work. Excavation meant disturbing remains, but leaving everything untouched risked letting the past disappear again. Eventually, new methods emerged. Non-invasive archaeology that used radar, scanning, and soil analysis to map camp structures without digging. These technologies preserved sanctity while revealing the invisible architecture of genocide. Through them, researchers reconstructed entire camp layouts: barracks, latrines, paths, fences, even gas chamber foundations. It was like bringing ghosts into focus. One of the most emotional breakthroughs came at Sobibor, when archaeologists uncovered the foundation of the gas chambers long thought lost forever. The concrete outline was faint but unmistakable. Survivors wept. Historians exhaled with a mixture of sorrow and relief. The world finally had physical proof that even the Nazis' most thorough cover-up could not erase. As rediscovery continued through the decades, the ghost camps began to speak, not through buildings or ruins, but through soil chemistry, electromagnetic signatures, tree growth patterns, and tiny remnants of human life. Each site offered fragments. Together, they formed a mosaic of truth. A mosaic created not only by archaeologists and historians, but by the land itself refusing to forget. And yet, the story does not end here. Rediscovery laid the foundation for understanding, but understanding alone was not enough. The next challenge became preservation, commemoration, and confronting the uneasy truth that many ghost camps remained untouched by memorials. Some still look like peaceful forests. Some remain hidden beneath farms or roads. Some are marked only by the stories of those who survived. In the next chapter, we turn to the ghost camps as they exist today, silent landscapes carrying memories beneath their roots, their soil, their wind, and their silence. Chapter 13. Ghost Camps Today. Silent landscapes that hold the past. If you arrive at one of these places on a quiet morning, you might think you've stumbled into nothing more than a tranquil forest or a peaceful meadow. Leaves tremble softly in the wind. Birds call from somewhere deep in the branches. Sunlight pours through gaps in the canopy, illuminating patches of moss like glowing emeralds. The air smells of pine, earth, and distant water. Nothing looks unnatural. Nothing looks wrong. But stay long enough, walk slowly enough, and something shifts. A tension rises from the soil. The silence grows heavier. The ground seems to hold its breath. You begin to feel that this place is not as empty as it appears. These are the ghost camps of today, landscapes where memory and nature intertwine so tightly that the boundary between past and present blurs into something haunting, something sacred, something deeply unsettling. Most people expect a memorial to look like a memorial: monuments, plaques, stone markers, manicured paths. But many ghost camps have none of these. They exist in fields where farmers plant wheat or potatoes. They exist beneath highways. They exist behind abandoned factories or inside dense forests where the underbrush has grown so thick that walking becomes difficult. Some exist under new buildings. Some under playgrounds. Some under nothing more than decades of fallen leaves. Their invisibility is not accidental. It is the final legacy of the Nazis' attempt to erase them, and a natural world's unintentional collaboration in that erasure. But the land remembers. The body remembers. The silence remembers. In a forest near Sobibor, the trees grow in eerily straight lines. They stand like soldiers frozen in formation, marking the footprint of long-gone barracks. LiDAR imaging has revealed rectangular depressions beneath the pine needles, outlines of structures that the naked eye cannot see. When the wind blows, The branches hiss softly, almost like whispers. Visitors sometimes report feeling watched, though logically they know they are alone. The forest is beautiful, but the beauty carries a sharp edge. It feels wrong to smile here. It feels wrong to breathe freely. At Treblinka, wildflowers bloom where the camp once stood. They sway in the summer breeze, delicate and bright. But their roots grow in soil mixed with ash. The earth itself is a cemetery without markers, a graveyard where tens of thousands lie without names, without graves, without stones placed by loved ones. Hikers walk through the fields, stepping unknowingly over layers of human history compressed into sediment. The air tastes clean, but the land carries an echo of something burned. In Belzec, the ground still sinks irregularly. Rainwater pools and shallow dips, remnants of mass graves that collapsed as bodies decomposed. The soil is too dark, too rich, fed by nutrients that should never have returned to the earth. Researchers describe a metallic scent rising after rainfall, as though the land exhales the memory of fire. If you press your hand to the grass, you feel warmth that has no logical source. Survivors say the place feels alive with sorrow. Other ghost camps hide behind modern life. A former subcamp near Berlin now sits beneath an office park. Employees walk to work each morning, unaware that the ground beneath the concrete once held hundreds of forced laborers. A child's playground covers another forgotten site. Laughter echoes where cries once rose. The metal slide sits exactly where barracks once stood. The contrast is jarring and deeply human. Life has replaced death, but the transition is unmarked, unacknowledged. Some ghost camps lie beneath farmland. Each spring, plows churn through soil mixed with the traces of prisoners' clothing, tools, bones, and ashes. Farmers sometimes find objects, coins, buckles, buttons, but few know their origin. They toss them aside or place them on shelves without understanding the weight they carry. The crops grow tall and golden, swaying in the breeze as though blessing the land. But beneath the surface, the ghosts remain. Even when the land appears empty, the atmosphere can betray its past. Visitors often describe feeling a heaviness in their chest when they step into certain clearings. They feel the air thicken. The forest grows silent. Birds stop singing. Even the wind seems to pause. It is a silence that demands respect, a silence that is not peaceful but solemn. One historian described it as walking into a memory that does not belong to you. Another said, the land feels aware. In some ghost camps, remnants still cling to existence. A rusted fence post, a concrete slab, a watchtower foundation cracked by decades of frost, moss-covered bricks arranged in a perfect line. These fragments draw the eye like magnetic anchors. Visitors kneel to touch them, running their fingers over the rough surfaces, trying to imagine what once stood here. It is an act of communion as much as history. But the most haunting ghost camps are the ones where nothing remains physically, only atmosphere. These are sites where nature grew so rapidly that the past dissolved into roots, bark, soil, and sky. Standing in these places feels like standing inside absence itself. It is the absence that speaks. The emptiness is the memorial. In Latvia and Lithuania, entire stretches of forest, once used as mass shooting sites, now look indistinguishable from surrounding woodlands. Sunlight dapples the leaves. Mushrooms grow in abundance. The ground is soft beneath your feet. But if you dig just a few centimeters, bone fragments appear, white, brittle, ancient. The forest grows from death. The forest thrives because of death. This realization is almost unbearable. Not all ghost camps are hidden by nature. Some are erased or overwritten by human development. In the Czech Republic, a former transit camp is now a housing district. Apartments stand atop the footprints of barracks. Residents walk their dogs on sidewalks where prisoners once lined up for roll call. Cars drive over spaces that were once execution sites. The city has forgotten. Only the archives remember. At other sites, the erasure is more subtle. A former subcamp near Krakow now hosts a small industrial park. The hum of machines fills the air. Workers in orange vests carry boxes and operate forklifts. They move quickly and efficiently. The smell of diesel replaces the smell of burning wood and sweat. The geometry of the camp lies embedded beneath the foundations, invisible but present. The workers feel nothing unusual, yet the ground beneath them is saturated with history. Sometimes the ghostliness emerges not in what is seen, but in what is felt. People report chills even on warm days. They describe unexplained sadness. They speak of sensing movement in the corner of their eye, though no one is there. These feelings are not supernatural. They are psychological manifestations of human empathy colliding with historical trauma. Standing on ground where mass suffering occurred changes the way the body perceives the environment. The land becomes a conduit for memory. In recent years, memorials have begun to take shape at several ghost campsites, but they often embrace minimalism. Rather than reconstructing buildings, designers leave the land mostly untouched, allowing absence to speak. At Sobibor, metal outlines mark where structures once stood. At Treblinka, stones represent the lost communities. At Belzec, the memorial uses jagged concrete to evoke a scar in the earth. These memorials are powerful precisely because they do not try to recreate what was lost. They acknowledge that loss itself is the story. Yet hundreds of ghost camps still remain unmarked. Researchers know their approximate locations, but the exact boundaries have blurred. Nature has obscured everything. Some of these sites lie on private property, making excavation difficult. Others lie under protected forests where digging is restricted. And some sites are known only through faint hints, LiDAR scans, wartime maps, a survivor's gesture pointing into the distance. These places exist in a state of liminality, suspended between knowledge and mystery. The continued existence of ghost camps raises difficult questions about memory, responsibility, and the future. Should every site be marked? Should every field where prisoners suffered receive a monument? Or should some sites remain untouched, allowed to be reclaimed by nature as part of the healing process? There is no easy answer. Some argue that marking every camp risks creating a world overwhelmed by memorials. Others say failing to mark them risks allowing forgetfulness to triumph. For many survivors and descendants, visiting these ghost camps is a profoundly emotional experience. They walk through the trees quietly, feeling the past through their footsteps. They kneel to touch the earth. They whisper names. They leave stones, flowers, or candles. Some speak aloud to the relatives they lost, believing the land carries their voices. Others say nothing, overwhelmed by the enormity of standing in a place where life once ended violently and silently. The landscapes evoke different emotions depending on the visitor. Some feel sorrow. Others feel anger. Some feel awe at the resilience of nature. Others feel fear at how easily history can be hidden. Many feel a strange sense of peace, not because the past is gone, but because the land has transformed suffering into something quiet, something sacred. One visitor described it as a cemetery with no gravestones, but 1,000,000 souls. The presence of these ghost camps today serves as a reminder of something crucial. That memory is not only carried by people, but also by places. Soil retains traces of ash. Trees grow in patterns shaped by human destruction. Water carries minerals from remains. Landscapes become memorials, even when no human hand carves the stone. And still, the most haunting truth is this. The ghost camps look ordinary. Beautiful even. The sun sets behind a line of birch trees. A breeze rustles through tall grass. A deer steps cautiously into a clearing. Life continues. Nature moves forward. And beneath it all lies an invisible city of the dead. As we turn to the next chapter, we confront a question that lies at the heart of Holocaust memory. Why were some camps preserved and memorialized while others were forgotten? What forces, political, geographic, emotional, decided which sites received recognition and which vanished in silence? The ghost camps are not just landscapes. They are mirrors that reveal what the world chooses to remember and what it chooses to forget. Chapter 14: Memory versus Oblivion. Why some camps were preserved and others forgotten. There is a moment when walking through one of Europe's unmarked ghost camps where you suddenly realize that memory is not just something people carry. It is something people choose. And choice is dangerous. Choice means some places are remembered because nations decided they should be, while others slipped quietly into obscurity because no one fought for them, or because someone fought to bury them. Standing in a clearing where a forgotten camp once stood, with the sun warming your face and the wind brushing softly through the grass, it feels impossible to imagine that this place once echoed with screams, orders, marching boots, the crack of gunfire. But memory is selective. It is shaped by politics, by geography, by fear, by shame, by agenda, and by time. This chapter explores one of the most haunting aspects of the Holocaust. Not just the violence itself, but how the world decided which places deserved remembrance, and which were allowed to disappear. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Europe was in ruins. Cities lay in rubble. Millions were displaced, sick, starving. Governments collapsed. New borders emerged. In this chaos, the abandoned camps scattered across forests, fields, and industrial zones faded into the background. Soldiers were overwhelmed. Civilians were traumatized. Investigators were stretched thin. And in many places, there was simply no one left alive to demand preservation. The victims were gone, their families murdered, their communities erased. Who would fight to save a camp when there were no survivors to tell the world what had happened there? Auschwitz, Majdanek, and Dachau became memorials early because liberating soldiers saw them almost intact. Buildings still stood. Barracks still lined the perimeter. Crematoria remained, silent but unmistakable. Their physicality demanded attention. The world could not ignore them. Photographs taken at liberation showed piles of bodies, starving prisoners, torture rooms, gas chambers. These images circulated globally, shaking viewers to their core. Governments recognized their symbolic importance, and preservation began. But for many other camps, especially the smaller ones, the picture was different. By the time soldiers arrived, the Nazis had burned everything. Subcamps collapsed in winter storms. Temporary sites dissolved into the earth. A field looked like a field. A forest looked like a forest. There were no buildings left to preserve, no piles of belongings, no visible graves. The absence itself became a barrier to remembrance. Political forces after the war deepened this divide. In the Soviet Union, the official narrative of the war emphasized Soviet suffering and heroism. Jewish identity, Jewish death, and Jewish memory were often downplayed or ignored. Extermination camps in Soviet territory received little attention. Treblinka was briefly investigated, but the forest quickly swallowed its traces. Belzec remained almost unstudied for decades. Sobibor faded into an agricultural field with only a small, obscure marker. The Soviet government had little interest in highlighting atrocities committed specifically against Jews, and even less interest in preserving sites that contradicted its narrative of a heroic, united suffering. In Western Europe, the story took another turn. Countries like France, the Netherlands, and Belgium had their own complicated wartime histories. Collaboration, complicity, and silence haunted their societies. Some preferred not to memorialize sites that forced the public to confront uncomfortable truths. Locals had sometimes worked with German authorities or had watched deportations without resistance. Preserving a camp meant acknowledging collective responsibility. Forgetting was easier. Meanwhile, in Germany, guilt created a different reaction. Some towns wanted the sites gone, covered, erased, believing that removing the physical reminder would help them move forward. Others feared memorials would attract international scrutiny. Factories expanded over former subcamps. Housing developments rose on spaces once used for forced labor. The urge to rebuild overtook the urge to remember. Then there were the places so remote that no one knew they existed. Camps built deep in forests, surrounded by marshes, or hidden in valleys have been designed for secrecy. After the war, nature reclaimed them so aggressively that even locals were unsure of their exact locations. Without survivors returning to point and say, "Here," these sites became ghosts long before historians rediscovered them. But even where survivors existed, remembrance was not guaranteed. Many survivors tried to rebuild their lives far from Europe. They rarely spoke about the camps for years. Trauma silenced them. Shame silenced them. The fear that no one would believe them silenced them. Without their voices pushing governments and communities to preserve sites, the land disappeared behind new growth. Grass covered the barracks. Roots split open the foundations. Rain dissolved the last traces of fences. Memory depends on witnesses, and the world had very few left. Even when survivors did speak, politics often overshadowed their calls. In communist Poland, Auschwitz was preserved, but Brzezinka, Birkenau, became a battleground of narratives. Jewish memory versus Polish memory versus Soviet ideology. Smaller camps like Plasso, where Oskar Schindler's workers had been held, were flattened into quarry landscapes. The barracks were bulldozed. The graves were left unmarked. Apartments and parks were later built over parts of the site. Today, dog walkers stroll paths once used for roll call. In Croatia, the Jasenovac camp complex, one of the deadliest, was transformed into farmland after the war. Later, Yugoslav authorities built a striking abstract monument, but they left the land unexcavated. Much of the truth remained buried out of political convenience, nationalist tensions, and fear of reopening ethnic wounds. In the Baltics, where Einsatzgruppen carried out mass shootings in forests, Soviet authorities often transformed former killing fields into recreation areas or military training grounds. The trees grew tall, covering every trace. Bulldozers flattened pits that had once held thousands of bodies. Silence replaced memory. Meanwhile, in the West, trials like Nuremberg focused heavily on major camps, not peripheral ones. The legal system inadvertently decided which camps mattered. Photographs of Auschwitz influenced global recognition. The lack of photographs from sites like Troniki or Milek or Skarżysko-Kamienna relegated them to obscurity. Another reason some camps disappeared from memory was logistical. Building memorials costs money, requires maintenance, demands political will. Forested ghost camps require clearing, signage, land rights negotiations, archaeological surveys. Small, rural municipalities often lack the funds or interest. And without pressure, nothing happened. But the deepest factor shaping memory was emotional fatigue. After the war, Europe was saturated with trauma. Concentration camps were everywhere. Death march routes crossed every region. Villages still smelled of smoke. Cemeteries overflowed. People wanted to rebuild, to heal, to forget. They wanted fresh air, sunlight, quiet. They wanted the past to retreat behind them. This desire, understandable as it was, allowed many campsites to fade into the landscape unnoticed. Yet while oblivion grew, memory was not entirely lost. It survived in fragments. In a family story whispered at a kitchen table. In a survivor's tattooed number, fading but still visible. In a diary page discovered in an attic. In the soil beneath a pine tree. Memory became a mosaic made of pieces the world nearly discarded. And slowly, decades later, too late for many survivors, interest awakened again. Historians dug deeper. Archaeologists probed forests. Jewish organizations demanded preservation. Governments reconsidered the narrative. Suddenly, the forgotten camps became urgent. People realized that if these sites were not marked, not protected, not studied, they would dissolve into the land forever. Rediscovery brought new forms of remembrance. Some ghost camps now have small plaques placed discreetly at the edge of a clearing. Others have wooden posts outlining where barracks once stood. At times, the memorial is nothing more than a stone laid by a survivor, a gesture echoing the ancient Jewish custom of marking graves. These small acts of remembrance carry immense emotional weight precisely because the landscape itself offers so little to guide the imagination. But hundreds of ghost camps still remain unmarked today. Some remain unknown. Some lie beneath modern structures. Some remain on private land where owners refuse access. Some remain under political tension, places where nations disagree about how or whether to remember. This uneven memorial landscape forces us to confront a difficult truth. Remembrance is not guaranteed. It must be chosen, fought for, demanded. And yet, even in the absence of physical memorials, the land remembers. Soil chemistry retains traces of ash. Shifted topography reveals former trenches. Trees grow in unnatural alignments. Rivers carry microscopic evidence. Landscapes whisper stories to those who know how to listen. Standing in a ghost camp today, whether marked or unmarked, whether in a forest or a field, you are confronted with a powerful contradiction. The earth looks ordinary. Life flourishes where death once ruled. Birds sing. Children play. Workers build. Light falls gently on ground that once shook with terror. And yet beneath all this beauty lies a truth that refuses to die. These ghost camps stand as reminders not only of what happened, but of how fragile memory can be, and how easily the world can allow part of its own history to vanish. In the next chapter, we turn to the voices fighting against that vanishing. The last generation of survivors, scholars, archivists, and digital historians working to preserve what remains. Because one day soon, there will be no witnesses left to speak, and the responsibility of remembering will fall entirely on us. Chapter 15. The Last Voices, Preserving the Legacy of the Ghost Camps. There is a moment, late in the evening, when memory feels like a living thing. A survivor sits in a small room, perhaps in New York, or Tel Aviv, or London, wrapped in a blanket, the soft hum of a heater filling the silence. A camera is set up across from them. A historian or archivist sits nearby, asking gently, quietly, "Can you tell us what you remember?" The survivor closes their eyes. Breath trembles. Time folds. And for a moment, the ghost camps rise again. Not as fields or forests, not as forgotten earth, but as vivid landscapes forged for memory. They speak for the dead. They speak for places erased. But these voices are fading. Their breaths are slower. Their hands shake. Their stories, carried for a lifetime, tremble on the edge of silence. This is the final chapter of the ghost camps, when the last living witnesses speak into a world that must learn to remember without them. In the decades after the war, survivors spoke sparingly. The world was not ready to listen. Families were not ready to hear. Many survivors built new lives with a quiet desperation to move forward. But as they aged, something shifted. The stories they had carried privately began to push outward, pressing against the walls of their hearts. They felt the weight of responsibility, not just to their own loved ones who died, but to the truth itself. They understood that history could fade as easily as the footprints in a forest reclaimed by moss. And so, they began to talk. But talking was never simple. Memory is not a photograph. It is a sensation, a sound, a smell, a flash of color. Survivors struggled to describe the cold they felt during death marches, the hunger that hollowed their bodies, the terror that lived inside their bones. They struggled to describe the physical reality of ghost camps, places with no names, no official markers, no surviving structures. They waved their hands in the air, trying to shape something invisible. Some cried. Others went silent mid-sentence, staring into a space only they could see. Every detail they shared felt like rescuing something from the brink of oblivion. Archivists recorded everything. The scratch of a pen, the way a survivor's voice cracked when describing the disappearance of a loved one, the sound of deep breaths taken before recounting an execution. These recordings became sacred artifacts in themselves, objects that carried not just information, but emotion, presence, humanity. And behind each story was an urgency. Remember this when I cannot speak anymore. The urgency intensified as the survivors grew older. Shadows lengthened across their lives. They felt time narrowing around them. Many feared dying before their stories reached the next generation. They feared the silence of the ghost camps growing stronger. They feared the world's memory becoming shallow, dominated by simplified narratives, reduced to textbook summaries. They feared denialism, voices that insisted the ghost camps never existed precisely because nothing physical remained. And so, survivors used their final years to speak louder, clearer, with a gravity that only those who witnessed horror could summon. Historians felt the urgency too. They traveled across continents to interview survivors, sometimes meeting them in hospital rooms. They rushed to document testimonies before voices weakened. They digitized photographs, scanned letters, mapped burial sites, collected artifacts. They walked through forests with survivors, who pointed to patches of ground and whispered, "It was here." They followed these gestures like compass needles pointing to buried truth. Digital preservation became a revolution in Holocaust memory. Entire archives migrated from fragile paper to online databases accessible across the world. Three-dimensional models of erased camps began appearing on screens, reconstructed with painstaking accuracy using aerial photography, soil analysis, witness testimonies, and even tree growth patterns. Buildings that had been burned decades earlier rose again as virtual ghosts, allowing future generations to walk through the digital corridors of places that no longer existed physically. Developers used lasers to scan landscapes, revealing foundations the forest had hidden. Drone footage captured aerial views of fields that once held thousands. Historians layered testimonies over digital maps, syncing voices with locations. "This is where we slept, here was the fence, there was the pit." And yet, even as technology advanced, the emotional experience remained deeply human. Every rediscovered detail carried the weight of a life lost. Every reconstructed building reminded researchers that behind every square meter of a camp were people, dreaming, fighting, trying to survive. Historians often spoke of feeling emotionally overwhelmed. Some described nightmares. Others felt a heaviness in their chest that lingered long after fieldwork ended. They carried the ghost camps with them, not as theories or data, but as moral responsibilities. Educators struggled with their own challenge: how to teach a new generation about places that no longer exist. Students today cannot walk into intact barracks at Belzec or Sobibor. They cannot see the gas chambers at Treblinka. They cannot touch the walls that once trapped tens of thousands. Instead, they must learn to understand absence as evidence, emptiness as testimony, silence as a form of truth. Teachers developed new methods. They brought students to forests and fields and asked them to imagine what once stood there. They taught them to notice unnatural depressions in the soil. They played survivor recordings on headphones while students walked silently through the trees. They showed them digital reconstructions overlaid with real landscapes, merging past and present into a single emotional experience. The goal was not to traumatize, but to make the lesson real enough that forgetting became impossible. For descendants of survivors, the ghost camps carry a different kind of weight. They feel the past through stories told at dinner tables, through photographs missing names, through inherited grief. Many have visited the ghost camps themselves, searching for connections to relatives they never met. They walk slowly, feel the soil beneath their shoes, touch the bark of trees, whisper names into the wind. They become, in a sense, new witnesses, witnesses not of the events, but of their echoes. They carry their ancestors' survival inside them like a flame, a responsibility passed from one generation to the next. But even as some people fight to preserve memory, others try to distort it. Denialism persists, quietly in some places, loudly in others. Some claim the numbers are exaggerated. Some claim the camps never existed. Some point to the lack of physical remains as evidence of fabrication. This is why the ghost camps matter so profoundly. They reveal the truth not through intact buildings, but through absence that requires explanation, absence created by deliberate erasure. Historically trained researchers counter denialism with precision. They analyze soil composition. They use ground-penetrating radar to reveal burial pits beneath forests. They match survivors' descriptions with topographical maps. They trace railway routes to fields that once served as unloading ramps. They use DNA analysis to confirm human remains beneath farmlands. They publish reports and open-access databases. They hold public lectures and exhibitions. They speak with unwavering authority. The failure to see a building does not mean it never stood here. Yet for all the scientific advances, rediscovery and preservation remain human endeavors at their core. A historian kneels in a forest, brushing leaves away from a concrete fragment. An archaeologist lifts a rusted spoon from the soil. A descendant picks up a pebble and places it gently at the edge of a clearing. A survivor whispers to the wind, "I remember." These gestures, small, reverent, powerful, are acts of resistance against oblivion. The ghost camps also challenge us to reflect on the ethics of remembrance. How do you memorialize a place where nothing remains? Do you build a monument? Do you leave the land untouched? Do you erect signs? Do you preserve silence? Is silence itself the memorial? These questions have no simple answers. Some communities choose minimalist markers. Others construct museums. Others designate the land as protected historical sites. But the most meaningful approach may be the simplest, returning to the land, walking it, acknowledging its history with presence and attention. In the last decade, digital technologies have transformed remembrance yet again. Virtual reality tours allow visitors to step into reconstructions of Sobibor or Treblinka, seeing spatial relationships impossible to visualize otherwise. Three-dimensional models rotate on museum screens, showing how camps evolved over time. Artificial intelligence stitches together survivor testimonies into interactive conversations, allowing future generations to ask questions and hear pre-recorded responses. These technologies cannot replace human memory, but they can extend it beyond the lifespan of witnesses. And still, the most powerful memorials remain the landscapes themselves. A group of trees growing too straight, a clearing that feels too quiet, a field where grass bends unnaturally in the wind. The ghost camps survive not because structures remain, but because the land itself refuses to forget. Soil carries particles of ash. Roots encircle fragments of bone. Rainwater moves through sediment, enriched with traces of human remains. The forest is not passive. It is a keeper of memory. As the last survivors pass away, the responsibility of remembrance shifts entirely to those who remain. It becomes a moral obligation, not a historical one. To remember the ghost camps is to acknowledge the fragility of truth. It is to understand that erasure can be as violent as destruction. It is to recognize that silence can be both a wound and a warning. And it is to promise that the stories buried beneath forests and fields will not sink again into darkness. One day soon, no living voice will rise to tell us what happened. No trembling hand will point to a piece of ground and say, "Here." No survivor will sit across from a camera and summon the past with strength forged from unimaginable suffering. When that day comes, the ghost camps will remain as the last witnesses, landscapes carrying memories in their soil, their trees, their silence. It will be up to us to listen. And that may be the most haunting truth of all. The ghost camps will outlive the people who knew them, and the world must choose, actively, deliberately, whether their silence becomes memory or oblivion.